Follow the Parliament of Trinidad and Tobago on Twitter. Our call sign is @TTParliament.
The Honorable, the President.
Bill's second reading.
Honourable Senators, the debate on the second reading of the following bill, which was in progress when the Senate adjourned on Friday, April the 20th, 2018, will be resumed. A bill entitled, An Act to Amend the Property Tax Act, Chapter 4604. The Minister in the Ministry of Finance, Senator the Honourable Alison West, spoke and was the mover of the motion. Honourable Senators, on the last occasion, the Minister had concluded the moving of the motion, and therefore I now propose the question for debate. The question is that a bill entitled, An Act to Amend the Property Tax Act, Chapter 7604, be read a second time. Senator Mark.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this bill entitled An Act to Amend the Property Tax Act is another attempt by the government to raise revenue by any means necessary. And when we would have thought that we had cremated and buried this property tax back in 2010 with the defeat of the P&M under Patrick Manning, here we are in 2018 under the distinguished leadership of the Prime Minister, resurrecting a measure that he himself, and I will extensively refer to his contribution when he was in the opposition, when he himself, as leader of the opposition, not leader of the opposition, then Member of Parliament for Diego Martin West, having been removed from the cabinet, he was very, very opposed to this measure that we are dealing with here today. Now he has become the Prime Minister of this country. He is singing a different song. He's dancing to a different drum beat in this country at this time. So here it is, Madam President, the same players, some of them new, but some of them very, very familiar, have brought this legislation to the Parliament once more. And the mover of this bill was particularly silent on a couple issues. There was no mention whatsoever as to the purpose of the revenues that will be derived, where, for example, this revenue is going to be heading. Is it going into the consolidated fund, or is it going to be part of the local government reform that the government has been touting about? Are we going to see a link between property tax and an increase in services in our communities? That was not mentioned. Another area, Madam President, that the minister who piloted this measure was completely silent on was a surreptitious amendment in the committee stage in the other place, when we were told in the original bill, and I have a copy here, Madam President, which was laid, that the bill would take effect from the 30th of September 2018. And the Minister of Finance, in a very surreptitious manner, in the committee stage, amended it from the 30th of September to the 2018 to the 30th of September 2016. The Honorable Minister who piloted this bill had not mentioned a single word about this and how, Madam, this measure will impact on the ordinary working people of our country. No mention, but that is something I will have to address since the Minister failed to address that particular matter. Madam President, another thing that we didn't get from the Minister is what is the sum, what is the quantum of monies that they expect to derive from this measure over a period of time. We got some nebulous figure of $350 million or thereabout, or just under $500 million. And I want to dispute that, because we have done our calculations and we have seen it into the billions with all of the taxes that have to go to residential, commercial, Madam President, industrial, agricultural. It is billions of dollars that they are going to derive from this measure, Madam President. But you know what is critical, Madam President? Who will bear the burdens of this whole exercise? The ordinary working class man and woman. It is the working man, it is the middle class, it is the working poor that will be carrying the burden of this measure. And I will demonstrate to you how and why this is going to be realized, Madam President. So, Madam President, let us understand that a tax is supposed to be very fair, it's supposed to be very transparent, and it's not supposed to be discriminatory. And we are seeing in this property tax that the government is, in fact, proposing in several amendments measures that will not realize that particular objective. Madam President, I want to deal with this thing out front and early. Let's look, Madam President, at what our dear friend, the Prime Minister, who now heads the cabinet, what did the Prime Minister have to say about this tax? The Prime Minister said on the 18th of December, 2009, at 9 p.m. in the evening, what his views, Madam President, was on this property tax. And the Honorable Prime Minister was very, very clear in terms of what this tax supposed to do and what it was supposed to be about. The Honorable Prime Minister talked about the punitive nature of this measure, Madam President. He went on to indicate in this contribution that in the context of local government reform and in the context of this attempt to do what this bill says in the preamble, that it is a paradigm shift. We would have taken the opportunity to really make the paradigm shift based on the Tobago House of Assembly model. And he went on to say, let the people pay in their district and spend in their district and hold the people in the district accountable. And Madam President, the then Member of Parliament for Diego Martin West went on to indicate why he was in favor of the property tax being directed at local government and having those funds directed and collected by local government authorities. And he was using the Tobago House of Assembly model in order to demonstrate his position on this matter, Madam President. And he was saying wherever you talk and you look at property taxes, there's a link between that and local government and decentralization. He went on to indicate, Madam President, in his contribution that, and I quote, let us fast forward a bit to September next year. That was 2010 he's talking about. And it turns out that this measure raises 250 million or 300 million. What will the government say then? Will the government say we were right? It was not meant to increase the tax take? You move from less than 100 million to 250 million. Madam President, at that time, land and building taxes was about 100 million. The government was then proposing, with the property tax, it will go to 350 million or thereabout. And the honorable member was saying at that time, it will go between 250 million to 300. And he went on further to say, I do not like people to take me for a fool. I do not like people to try and fool me. I will have to fight back. We do not have long to wait, I guarantee you. I suspect that the 3% will be on values that are considerably higher than it is made out to be, because even the current market, where there had been some decline in property values in the country, property is here very worthwhile, and you would get good values for most property. Madam President, the honorable members was showing that the government was saying that they would only get 100 million, and the member was saying, no, you're going to get between 200 and 300 million. And he was making the point that the government was fooling the country at that material time. He went on further, Madam President, to say, and I quote, my constituents are angry and resentful of this tax because they have seen waste. I do not want to unnecessarily bash my colleagues. For heaven's sake, when you are coming to tax me in a situation where the item that I draw, that draws the tax, is not a revenue-raising measure for me, my colleague for Tobago East pointed out that many people in a house, and having done absolutely nothing, find that the house is worth $1 million, $2 million. And therefore, property value starts with location. Madam President, he goes on to say, instead of getting an apology, we get a spirited defense of the indefensible. And he goes on to say, when you make mistakes, the first thing you have to do is to acknowledge that you make a mistake. If you try to defend the indefensible, Madam President, you would provoke people and create resentment and anger. I think that is what we have at the moment. That is what the then Member of Parliament for Diego Martin West, now Prime Minister, said in his contribution in the House of Representatives on the 18th of December, 2009, at around 9 in the evening. Madam President, I raise these things to let you know that the honorable member said that just like WASA, sending bills to people and not supplying water, he was saying, like this bill, if you do not pay, they will take your property. This is what some of my constituents are living with, Madam President. So, Madam President, you have the former member of Parliament coming in 2009, totally opposed to the measure that the then Patrick Manning introduced, that is the property tax, and the other act or bill, and saying that he was totally opposed to that measure. The measure was going to hit his constituents very hard, and therefore he will have none of it. He's saying that he does not mind the measure going forward, but the monies must not be put into the consolidated fund. It must put into local government, like, and he gave the example of the Tobago House of Assembly model. Now, Madam President, I want to say that at no point in time were we informed, rather, that the government is going to use the revenue from this property tax to deal with services affecting the people in their communities. No one has enlightened us on this matter as to where the money is going to be heading. I am putting it to the government today that the monies that are being collected under property tax will be ending up, Madam President, directly into the consolidated fund. That is where the money is going to be heading. And therefore, the waste and the absence of proper accountability is going to take manifestation after this particular arrival at that point. And somewhere in his contribution as well, the honorable members made the point that a $100 increase in taxes or $200 increase in taxes on an annual basis means a lot to his constituents because they were struggling to make two ends meet. So whilst many of us would say $500 does not mean anything or means little or nothing, and $5,000 is a reasonable amount of money, what the then leader, the Prime Minister, member of for the Martin West was saying, that for his constituents, a $100 increase in property tax, more than they are paying, is a great amount of burden being placed on his constituents at the material time. So, Madam President, we would like to ask the Honorable Minister, how is this tax, this property tax, how is it going to be translated into reality? How is it going to impact, Madam President, on the working man? We talk about residential properties in this country, and we say it is a 3% application. But, Madam President, you know in this country, many citizens have to rent. The owners of those properties are going to pass on those rents or those increases in property taxes onto those persons who are renting from them. The landlords and the tenants. The tenants are going to be asked to bear the burdens. And, Madam President, if you move from the residents who will have to pay for an increase in property tax, and you go from the resident to the tenant, and you realize that the landlord will pass on that cost to the tenant, you now move to commercial. Commercial is 5%, and industrial is 6%. And, Madam President, if you take National Flour Mills as an example, and you have to apply that 5% onto national flour mills, and you look at their equipment, their property, their lands, and so on, and you apply a $5 to $10 million onto national flour mills to pay, let's say, industrial taxes, property taxes, on an annual basis. Madam President, what will happen to Kiss Bakery when they order flour from national flour mills? Not only is national flour mills going to increase the price of flour so that they could remain viable, but when they sell that flour to Kiss Bakery, who will now have to pay property tax? That is going to result in an increase in the prices of their output and their products to the ordinary people. And Madam President, I say these things to let you know that the government is introducing a very draconian measure that has far-reaching implications for the living standards, the livelihoods, the quality of life of the citizenry of our country. This property tax is going to result in the poor people becoming poorer and the rich people becoming richer under this regime. Madam President?
Senator Mark,
yes.
If I could just point out something to you. We are debating the property tax amendment bill. And therefore, I've allowed you a lot of leeway, but you are really, right now, you have confined your contribution thus far to the Property Tax Act, which is already in place. So I need you to address the bill itself. Okay?
Thank you. I go to clause 23 with your guidance immediately. Madam President, if you go to clause 23 of the bill, which is called the Property Amendment Bill, Madam President, what would you see? Let me tell you what is in the bill that I have before me. The bill, which has been amended and has been brought to this honorable House, says, Madam President, that Section 52(1) of the Act is amended by deleting the word 31st of December 2015 and substituting the word 30th of September 2016. Madam President, I would like the Minister of Finance to explain to this country what is the value of the back taxes that we are going to be called upon as citizens, first of all, people who own residences, the people who own commercial enterprises, the persons who have multi-dwelling units, the industrialists, the agriculturalists. We would like the government to tell this Parliament, when you make this thing retroactive, Madam President, from the 30th of September 2016, so it means to say 2016 to 2017, you have to pay backdated taxes. And 2017 to 2018, 30th of September, Madam President, we are called upon to pay back taxes. Madam President, if that is not the height of irresponsibility and almost, I go to say, evil and wickedness on the part of any administration, I don't know what is. Why would you want to impose on the population, Madam President, a retroactive payment effective from the 30th of September 2016? And Madam President, you know what is even more alarming? When the original bill, which I have before me, was tabled in the House of Representatives, Madam President, you know what was the date? Under Section 23, the date for giving effect to this measure was the 30th of September 2018. Why did the Minister of Finance, in the dead of night, decided to amend this particular section of the Property Tax Amendment Bill and send us back retroactively to the 30th of September 2016, Madam President? I would like the Minister to answer that question. Madam President, we are saying that this is a measure that is oppressive, it is draconian, it is unacceptable, it is obnoxious, it is indefensible, and we cannot support it. And we call on the government to withdraw this particular measure. Withdraw this measure. Let us go back to the original date, Madam President, which is the 30th of September 2018, and make it effective from that date. Don't go back to that date of the 30th of September 2016. So we are serving notice on the government that we intend to pilot an amendment to that effect, Madam President, where it will be back to 2018, 30th of September, Madam President. That's the first area of concern, Madam President, that we have with the legislation. We find it very, very unacceptable, indefensible, inexcusable, and totally archaic and backward and oppressive.
And no constitutional majority.
And because they know they don't have a constitutional majority, they are doing whatever they wish. But, Madam President, I want to tell this government, we have already indicated to them, you are dealing with property rights. And when you deal with property rights, there's a place and there's a time to settle these matters. If you don't settle it here, we will settle it elsewhere. Okay. You cannot take people for granted. You cannot continue to take advantage of people and believe that you could get away. You cannot, Madam President. So we want to warn the government about the approach that they are taking to property tax. Madam President, I am being guided by you, so I am going to the bill. Madam President, I go to 5 subsection 2 of the legislation. It reads, the liability to tax of the owner of any chattel fixed or affixed to land does not create a legal entitlement to the land upon which the chattel is located, where the owner of the chattel is not the legal owner of the land. Madam President, this is just technical jargon. It simply means, when you translate it, if you are a squatter living on a piece of property, you are not the legal owner. I am taxing you. I am imposing a property tax on you. But you know what? You are not the legal owner. But you have to pay the tax. So what this measure is doing, Madam President, is saying, if you have 100,000 people in this country who are squatters, the government is going to impose a property tax on 100,000 squatters. But the government is saying, you have no legal title, no legal ownership to the property, pay your property tax. That is what they are saying. And Madam President, just remember, these people have to fill out a form. And if they make a mistake in filling out that form, it could be interpreted as willful. And Madam President, you know where you end up with? $5,000, or you end up in jail. So who are we targeting here, Madam President? We are targeting the ordinary people who happens to be squatters in the system at this time. But we intend to regularize them as we move forward. We are going to be victorious at the next general election, and we will regularize the squatters. We will give them ownership of their property. We are committed to a land a home-owning democracy in the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. And Madam President, we are not opposed to we recognize that you have to pay some form of tax. That is why we are in support of the land and building taxes arrangement. But it must be done in a more modernized perspective. We want a more modernized approach. We know that Land and Building Taxes Act has been abolished. It was a 1920 version of colonialism. And we know that we have to modernize the Property Tax Act. And this is what we were doing when we were there. We were moving to modernize the land tax, the property tax, and the Land and Building Tax Act, and the Land Valuation Act at that particular time. But of course, we didn't get to the point of revising and revolutionizing the process of the property tax in Trinidad and Tobago. But that certainly, Madam President, is on our agenda. We have no intention whatsoever to proceed along the lines that the government has moved as it relates to this property tax. We intend to revise and we intend to modernize the Property Tax Act along the lines that we said in our budget of 2014. We are going along the Land and Building Taxes Act line, and we are going to phase in the increases over a period of years and not immediately, as you have done. You have brought a bill that says today, if it is passed, when you effect it, immediate effect, 3% on residential, 5% on commercial, 6% on industrial, 1% on agricultural. That is with immediate effect, Madam President. We are not in favor of that, Madam President. Madam President, we go on further to what is being proposed in this bill. If we go to Section 9 of the bill, Madam President, again we are seeing where the government is creating a new taxation system. But the taxation system needs to be fair, it needs to be transparent. But what we have observed is the following. Madam President, if you go to Section 9, subsection 1A, subsection A, you realize that if you overpay the Board of Inland Revenue, within 60 days, they are going to refund you such a payment. You waiting 60 days, Madam President, to get your repayment. However, if you are underpaid by the Board of Inland Revenue, it takes them 30 days. So if I overpay, I give you from my pocket more. They tell me wait for 60 days. In the old act, it was with immediate effect, forthwith, you make my payment. But I could understand you making the adjustment so that you don't want to go with forthwith. So you want to go with a few days, but you're going with 60 days. Madam President, and if you underpay me, Madam President, 30 days. It just doesn't add up, Madam President. Something is not fair, something is not balanced in this arrangement, Madam President. Madam President, the government has decided to brutalize pensioners.
Senator Mark, let's put that another way, please.
Well, they have decided to take advantage.
Senator Mark.
Advantage is not a good word, Mark?
No, Senator Mark, please try and refine what you have to say, please.
I didn't know in this court, that language, as I know it, is English, and we speak English. And I know, Madam President, I'm not querying or quibbling.
Senator Mark, so I'm going to speak some English here, and I'm asking you, please, to dial back on your rhetoric and refine what you are saying, okay?
What is rhetoric? I don't know what is rhetoric.
Senator Mark, you have a choice here. I can either ask you to abide by my ruling, or if you want me to provide you with a dictionary, I would ask you to take your seat and you can come here and I'll open the dictionary for you. Refine your language, please.
I will know what I have to do in the future. That is what I can tell this House. I'm not threatening anybody, but I have a right to speak.
Senator
anyway,
Mark.
I will make my contribution.
Senator Mark. This is the absolute last time I'm going to warn you, and then I will have to determine how I proceed. Please take note of what I am saying and continue your presentation in a proper manner.
I thought I was.
Senator Mark, no. Senator Mark, no. I have warned you repeatedly, and I'm therefore going to ask you to take your seat, and I'm now calling on the next speaker. Senator Shrikissoon.
Thank you, Madam President, for recognizing me and allowing me to also take a part, to contribute in this debate at this time, which almost feels as cutting ice in this House because of the tension. There. I need to go back for a helmet. Yes, but thank you, Madam President, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with my colleagues at least my perspective on this bill. Madam President, we are referring to the property tax bill, and before I get into the contents of the bill, I'd just like to make a few comments around the property tax bill. If I place this property tax bill in context, especially in terms of the financial position and the financial situation of our country, we have a situation where government projects roughly $37 billion in revenue and expenditure of $50 billion, which leaves a deficit of just about $13 billion. So if we look at property tax as a method or mechanism of financing this deficit, of bringing it together so as to provide the government with an additional source of revenue, then I can say that property tax... Thank you, Madam President. So with an expenditure of $50 billion and a revenue position of $37 billion, the concept of property tax, to be able to provide additional financing to the government in terms of financing that deficit, I think it has its place in terms of trying to balance the revenue position or improve the revenue position of the government. So I accept that. But whether or not property tax should really be used for that purpose is another question. But I understand the financial situation of the government with respect to property tax. However, I'd like to make a point, and it may be a little bit controversial, but I do so very respectfully, Madam President. If we reflect on Senator Rambarat's contribution to the budget debate of 2017-2018, he made a plea, and he said, you know, if it was possible to recoup any money from the Couva roundabout to pave agricultural roads, it would have significantly helped him in his area of his ministry. And I understand that. And then Senator Ramdeen, in his presentation, responded to that comment and said, and I just want to paraphrase because I don't really want to quote directly out of the Hansard, he referred to, what about the $300 million at the Petrotrin headquarters? What about the World GTL for $3 billion? What about the $1 billion cost overruns in the Brian Lara Stadium? Of which the Attorney General also responded in his contribution and said, well, what about the $1 billion to SIS? What am I getting at here? If you look at both sides of the political divide, both accuse each other of some element of mismanagement of public funds. And being able to identify what the other side has done or the other political party has done is no real justification for what is being done by one party. So my point here is, both sides, both political parties here in this House have recognized areas that expenditure may not have been done in the right way. And therefore, when this is done over time, it creates a burden because it has to be paid, you know. No matter how it's done, it has to be paid. A dollar revenue lost or a dollar spent badly has to be repaid. And that's why sometimes we find ourselves in this tight cash crunch, because the balances or the cash balances of Trinidad and Tobago could have been better or stronger if there was proper management of funds. across regimes. And therefore, the incidence of the burden of the tax may not have been so necessary or important at this time because of stronger balances, cash balances. But the fact and the reality of the situation is we don't have that. And I'm concerned about that. So what makes the burden heavier is mismanagement or ill expenditure. And the people of Trinidad and Tobago, through property tax, is now being asked to carry the burden. And that's the problem I have with the property tax. Because when it is being used as a financing mechanism, it could have been avoided if we had prudent management of funds. And that's why I bleed for the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Not that property tax doesn't have its place, or it cannot be used for the development of Trinidad and Tobago, but the way in which it is being used now at this point in time, in my mind, it's a little bit unfortunate, but I understand. But I would have preferred that that did not occur. Some may argue that the incidence of property tax is not very large, and we've heard contributions and calculations being tossed around, $1,000, $1,500 a year, which comes down to $80, $90, $100 per month, whatever it may be. But when you analyze that additional tax burden, and you're saying it's nominal, it's small, but when you analyze that additional tax burden against increases in business levy, increases in green fund, increase in corporation tax for finance for commercial banks, increase on VAT for 10,000 items, increase in the cost of gasoline, increase in custom duties, and against a possibility of increases in TNTEC and WASA rates. My point here is this. The nominal value of the tax may be small, but the cumulative burden of the taxation is what's affecting the public. Madam President, with respect to the revenue position of the government, and I quote from the estimates of revenue of the government budget statement 17 and budget statement 18. In 2017, 500 million was budgeted as the income to be derived from property tax. In 2018, it's adjusted to 250 million. I'm asking the question, how would these figures be derived? How were they derived? And how could they find themselves in statements of revenue when the valuation rule has not been prepared, the assessment rule has not been prepared, the agencies have not been established, example, the Valuation Tribunal. So in my mind, we're anticipating or expecting revenue of an incomplete process. The bills have not even been passed. But and the danger in that is that we're budgeting revenue and creating expenditure based on that revenue. So the problem is that is a great possibility by anticipating revenue like this and now having the bills being so being laid and probably passed or sent into so late on in the financial year that the money is derived or to be derived may not really be realized. And then we have a further deficit position like what happened in 2017 when we budgeted about we anticipated a $7 billion deficit and we ended up with 12. The same may occur in 2018, I'm unsure. And what is even worse with respect to this anticipation of revenue, and I mean this very respectfully, is that we amended the Central Bank Act, I think it was, to increase the overdraft from 15% to 20% of expected revenue. And therefore, when the revenue position is overstated or may not be achieved, then we have a little problem there too. And finally, Madam President, touching on clauses just before I get into the actual bill, the Honourable Minister, in her piloting the bill, did not spend too much time in addressing how the property tax and local government reform would have actually been linked. And if you allow me to quote from the draft paper on local government reform, and I'm quoting from page 27, it says, one of the major reasons given for the inability of local government bodies to deliver on their mandate to provide goods and services to the public is the lack of adequate funding. Page 28 says, it is this government's desire through its stated policy that municipal corporations should have a secure source of funds in order to deliver goods and services to the public. Provision must be made for the reinstatement of legislation of the municipal corporations that all the relevant revenue and taxation laws must be amended to allow for local government bodies to collect and retain property tax. What's my point here? This may have been a good place to introduce some level of legislation or some level of intent with respect to how property tax would be linked to local government reform. I did not really get that from the piloting. And sorry, Madam President, my last point before I get into the actual bill brings me to Budget Statement 2018. And I would like the opportunity to quote from this, and it's on page 14, that says here, the Business Development Incentive Program, it says here, we believe that in order, this is government's budget statement, we believe that in order to survive and grow in this challenging new financial environment, we must learn from other countries that have been successful. Small and medium-sized businesses are the mainstay of Europe's economy. It comes down to say, however, small businesses face a different range of problems than their larger counterparts due to their inability to enjoy some of the same advantages in the marketplace. Most of these problems are due to revenue and cash-on-hand availability when the bills become due. The last paragraph says, further, startup companies and small businesses frequently run on small margins and may be profitable only so long as unplanned events never occur or capital investments are required to keep abreast of the competition, such as new equipment or new accommodation. In many cases, all a small business needs to expand or maintain its operations is relatively small amounts of seed capital to purchase new machinery and raw materials. What's my point, Madam President? The point here with this is that the government in its budget statement indicated that the small and medium-sized sector would be critical to advancing the economy of Trinidad and Tobago. It's also saying that the economy of Trinidad and Tobago can be improved if the resources or the strategies are export-driven. This export-driven strategy is being fueled or supported by the small and medium-sized business sector. And the way in which export earnings or revenue could be earned is through manufacturing. Why am I making this link, this step-by-step link? Schedule 1 of the Parent Act refers to the percentage of the tax that is going to be applied to businesses or to properties. 3% for residential, 5% commercial, 6% industrial. A commercial property is one that could probably be defined as one that people visit. An industrial property would be one where goods are being produced or stored, like a warehouse. So what's the link between the point? How is it that we are trying to promote a sector such as the small business and small and medium-sized businesses, recognizing that manufacturing may be the way forward, but yet that is the same sector where we recognize in Budget 2018 is cash-strapped. But that's the sector that has the highest incidence of taxation with respect to property tax, 6%. 6% on property, plant, and equipment. That's the same sector we are trying to improve and push forward and advocate that this is the way forward for Trinidad and Tobago, yet this is a sector that attracts the highest rate of property tax. I see goal incongruence with the intent of the strategy and the taxation policy. It's the same thing I would have said with the International Financial Center having such a high, Trinidad having such high taxes for the financial sector, and we're trying to build an international financial sector. So while I do propose that with respect to this element of property tax, especially for manufacturing firms, if the government could consider incentivizing the companies that manufacture, especially if they are export-driven, with probably a lower rate of tax on their plant and equipment. That's my recommendation with respect to property tax on that. Madam President, now that I can focus squarely on the bill in front of us here, I want to go to Clause 3 of the bill, which seeks to introduce additional definitions of land from which revenue can be derived. This clause, I think, was also discussed on the Valuations of Land Act, and I didn't see it a problem there, but I just noticed something here that I wish to comment on. Clause 2A says, or Section 2A, I should say, says, where a building occupies separately from other buildings a location on a single parcel of land, the building shall, for the purpose of tax liability to tax under this act, be deemed land. It was the same for the single dwelling accommodation and commercial dwelling. My my area of concern here is that you have in A building occupies separately from other buildings. So you have a plot of land where there's a house, and a father owns the house. And later on, the son decides that he needs to build a home, and the father says, in the interim, you know what, you can build behind my home. Then how will tax liability come to that owner who now has a single deed for a single property, but now there are two buildings? Is it that we are going to introduce property tax on two houses on the same property for which there's a single deed or certificate of ownership? I asked that question. And so if it is that I am right, then can we consider amending the clause to state where the tax liability would be limited to properties properties that would be registered on a single deed? And if I could get that clause correctly, I would like to see a building occupies separately from other buildings, a location on a single parcel of land, and has a separate deed or certificate of ownership, so that it limits the taxation to properties that have legitimate certificates of ownership, and not necessarily the number of buildings on a parcel of land, especially on small family arrangements, which is a significant part of the culture of Trinidad and Tobago. Senator Mark, during his presentation, touched on one point that I want to agree with. And it says here in Clause 4 of the bill, Clause 4 of the bill says, Clause 4 of the bill says, there shall be raised, levied, collected, and paid to the board for the year beginning 1st January 2010 and for the 1st of January of every subsequent year, an annual tax in respect of all land. So I agree with that. I agree. In my mind, the tax is an annual tax, January to December, and then the payment is for within that year. But Section 52A of the bill, or Clause 52A of the parent bill, I think it's Clause 23 of the bill before us, 52A of the Act, says, notwithstanding any written law to the contrary, the payment of any tax under this tax shall be waived for the period January 1st, 2010 to 31st December 2015. Now we're amending this to 30th September 2016. My point here is this. If it's an annual tax, then the exemption should run from January to December, not January to September. Although the tax is payable as at September, the exemption should run for the entire calendar year and not part thereof. Because if it stops at September, it's a possibility that it could be interpreted as there's a tax liability for the latter months from post-September. Clause 6 of the bill refers to properties that can now or will now be exempted from property tax. The minister went into great detail in showing how this clause was tightening on the properties that would now be exempted. And I support the amendment that the Honourable Minister piloted while she was here, because I think that it lends strength to the legislation. So I think that this Clause 6 with the new amendments, I really welcome it, and I think it has brought clarity to the exemption. Clause 8 and Clause 8, Section 19, speaks of lands omitted from the assessment rule. It says here, Clause 19 of the bill seeks to address when a new building has been erected on lands that have been previously assessed as land alone. There's a wording here that I'd like to pay attention to. It says, this clause seeks to prorate the tax this clause seeks to prorate the tax liability according to time. So what it's saying here is that if there's a parcel of land that was assessed and a building has been erected, the tax will now be prorated from the number of months that existed before the building was erected and adjusted for the number of months post the building being constructed. I'm saying construction of a building usually takes some element of time. So to come to a definitive place of using the word erection of the building before and after may be a little bit challenging. I'm asking that we consider to use the words completion, so that the assessed tax would now be upon the number of months before completion of the house, and then prorated for the number of months post-completion, not erection of the house or the building, as that can usually have a timeline associated with it and can sometimes span more than a year, depending on the size of the building. The valuation role and its life. Mr. Vice President, Clause 19 of the bill also speaks about lands being omitted from the assessment rule. It may be and it says here, where land has been omitted from the assessment rule, it may at any time be added while the assessment rule is in operation and shall thereupon become liable for payment of the tax for the year within which such addition is made, and also for the payment of any tax for the preceding period during which the assessment rule has been in operation. I understand the clause. I think the clause is a good clause that says if it's omitted, then you just need to look and see, apply the tax date as well as retroactively on given the last date of the assessment rule. But the act or the bill before us doesn't really specify a life of the assessment rule. I think the Valuations Act says as close as possible to 5 years. But this bill and the Parent Act, I stand to be corrected, does not really have a life of the assessment rule. Every 5 years. So then I didn't really see it, but maybe it may. Sure, thank you. So that retroactively, I was just proposing, given that I didn't see it, Honorable Minister, but I thank you, that the application of taxes for lands omitted should not extend over 5 years going backward. So that's the comment I wanted to make if I did not see it. Mr. Vice President, the deferral of tax, Clause 12 of the bill. Clause 12 of the bill seeks to address Section 23 of the Act, which deals with the deferral of payment of assessed taxes. The deferral of payment being made on the following grounds: impoverished conditions of owner, the inability to improve his financial position, impaired health, and that undue hardship to the owner would otherwise ensue. And it goes on to state the conditions that must be met. However, I would like to say that I would have preferred an exemption rather than deferral. But I understand the government's position, but I just need to say this, that I would have preferred an exemption of the taxes where an exemption is being given, but it's taking on the form of a deferral. But I want to recommend that for this clause, that where deferral is given, and we're seeing here that the clause is being introduced for 2 years, that a certificate of deferral is given to the landowner. Why do I recommend this? The certificate of deferral will have the time of the exemption, the period, whether it's 1 year or 2 years, the amount of the exemption, the property for which it is being assigned, and that certificate can be given to the owner via post or anything like that to justify his incidence or liability of the tax, as well as be registered wherever the tax is being paid to show that the property has a tax deferral benefit for this period. In the event that records are lost, that certificate can also be used to calculate the total deferred tax liability later on when it becomes due. And so I'm asking for consideration for that. Clause 13 of the bill also refers to Clause 26, which pertains to the board revoking or varying a deferred tax benefit. The actual clause says, before exercising its power under the section, the board shall afford to the owner reasonable opportunity to show cause why the authorization should not be varied or revoked. Clause 3, that subsection 3 says, the board shall issue a notice in writing of any decision to grant or revoke. I would like to strengthen this aspect of the law. I would like to suggest that a clause be added to this that says where the deferred benefit was revoked, that portion of the year for which the deferral is no longer covering, that the person is now liable for that tax. So that at that period for which the revocation has occurred, the owner of the property is now liable for that tax and becomes due immediately. Mr. Vice President, Clause 14 of the bill seeks to amend Clause 27, which refers to the deferred tax benefit to cease upon death of the owner. And 27.1 says that the deferred benefit becomes immediately payable out of the estate of the deceased owner. Mr. Vice President, I see a small challenge here, because when someone dies, the estate is not readily available for successor. Usually it has to go through probate proceedings, and that can extend that can be for a short time or a long time. And therefore, I'm asking that if the government would consider that the tax liability on the property be settled upon completion of probate proceedings rather than the death of the owner, as there's a time gap there. Also, Mr. Vice President, sticking to the same arrangement or the same clause, where the probate proceedings extend more than 1 year, the tax liability will also be incurred by the successor. And so I'm asking if the tax liability for the property during the years of probate become payable upon the probate proceedings be granted, but where the probate is granted. However, it should not attract any interest and penalties for the successor. Clause 27 of the bill speaks of the deferred tax benefit becoming due upon the death of the owner. 27.2 of the Act 27.2 of the Act refers to where the application of the successor in title of the estate, the board is satisfied having regard to the impoverished conditions of the successor in title of the estate of his inability to improve his financial position. What this clause is really talking about is 27.1, there is a deferred tax benefit. 27.2 is saying the board, the successor can benefit from applying to the board. In my mind, between 27.1 and 27.2, there's a small gap that does not say that upon the successor having gained title to the land, he can apply to the board. The 27.2 speaks of the board making a decision. 27.1 speaks about the deferred tax becoming due. So I'm asking if consideration can be given to that part, that aspect of it. So that there's a definitive step that says the successor can apply to the board. Clause 18 of the bill refers to Section 34 of the Act, where it says any amount of tax is not paid on or before the 15th of September, and that date is now changed to the 30th of December. It later on refers to a 6-month extension where it comes down to the 16th of March. I'm asking if the words of the ensuing year can be inserted there, because there's some element of controversy or not being specific in my mind where we refer to the 30th of September and the 16th of March. It should be the 30th of September and 15th of March of the next ensuing year. I thought that Senator Mark would have raised one of these issues, but he didn't. I know that this is a favorite of him. And it came down to Clause 24, which seeks to amend 53A of the bill. The minister may, by order, amend Schedules 1 and 4, and Schedule 1 having the tax liability to be assigned to the citizen of Trinidad and Tobago. I do believe that if the schedule is there and has a tax rate that has to be applied to determine the tax that a citizen is liable to pay, an amendment to that schedule should have or should be subject to the affirmative resolution of Parliament, because it's a tax liability that will create a tax burden on the citizens. And so, Mr. Vice President, I'm unsure of how much time I have, but I know I've made a couple points. So sorry.
Till 6:29.
Thank you. Also, I have some time. So, Mr. Vice President, in order to try and pull this entire contribution together, I would like the opportunity to just bring it back and just summarize briefly what I've said before, because I think I've gone so widely into the bill. My first point here that I said earlier today is that I have shown that a significant reason for the citizenry to pay property tax is as a result of some element of mismanagement across regimes in the past. There are allegations based on both sides of the House indicating where expenditure was ill-appropriated, and that in itself is creating a burden on the people of Trinidad and Tobago. Property tax may have been able to be avoided if we had prudent management of expenditure. Mr. Vice President, I also said that while the incidence of the tax may be small in some cases, probably more so for residential properties, the cumulative burden of increased taxations in the recent past will have a significant impact on the lifestyle and pockets of our citizenry. It's not just about the nominal or value of the tax, but the cumulative effect. With respect to recognition of revenue in the budget statements for 2017 and 2018, that has some implications for deficit financing, as well as probably even obtaining debt to satisfy a deficit that has created because we have anticipated or budgeted revenue for which the process and institutions and the law, they've all been non-completed or incomplete at this time. I ask the government to consider that. I did not, and I did make reference to local government, where the draft policy on local government did indicate that there would be some element of property tax being linked to the development of local government, of municipal corporations. I did not get the intent of that at all in this bill, nor the way in which it would be proposed. I also said that the property tax bill, this property tax bill, introduces a 6% tax on industrial properties, industrial property being classified as properties where goods are being produced. Budget statement of the government did indicate that this sector is very critical to the advancement of Trinidad and Tobago. And so I am saying 6% on a small business that's manufacturing is very harsh, especially at a time where this is the sector we are looking to. I did ask for consideration with respect to the definition of land, where it's restricted to only those that have certified or separate deeds of ownership and where there are multiple buildings. I did commend the government for Clause 6 with respect to the exemptions. With respect to Clause 8 of the bill, which refers to Section 19, where lands are being omitted, the Honourable Minister did say that it's 5 years. I am saying that if you're setting taxes backward, there should be a maximum of 5 years retroactively, the year that it's incurred, and 4 years backward. I've also asked for consideration to be given to Clause 8, where lands were omitted. That was the point, sorry. And then I have asked with respect to Clause 23, where deferred tax benefit is granted, a certificate of deferral be given to the owner. This will have significant administrative benefits in determining the tax liability in years to come, as well as proof and justification that an exemption or deferral was granted. I've also asked, with respect to Section 27, which addresses properties where there's now a successor in title. I did propose that the deferment to cease upon the death of the owner, yes, but the tax deferred to be paid by the successor upon completion of probate proceedings. Any tax incurred after death of the owner, but before the completion of probate proceedings, to be incurred by the successor, but these taxes will not incur any interest and penalties. I did point out in Section 27 that in my mind there's a missing step between the liability of the tax becoming due in 27-1 and the board granting a benefit if they are of the view the successor is unable to pay this deferral. So I've asked that a clause be inserted to state that upon becoming the successor in title, if the owner is unable to pay the tax, then he can apply to the board. With respect to Clause 52A or Section 52A of the bill, with respect to amending the schedule of rates of taxation, I do ask for consideration that the rates of taxation, it's very important because that really hits at the heart of property tax, the percentage taxable value, that this schedule be subjected to affirmative resolution of Parliament. So, Mr. Vice President, with those few words, I would like to say that the property tax bill, I'm seeing the relevance of it from a financing mechanism for the government. Whether or not it should be used like that, I do not believe that. I think that some element of the bill has been anticipated and rushed, and somewhat rushed, having anticipated revenue and budgeted revenue in 2017 and 2018, when the procedures, the law, the divisions have not really been established. And so the government has also been very, very cordial with respect to receiving amendments from the independent bench, as on some of mine, personally, as we make it across the floor, and they're very, very receptive in responding. So I do ask that the same would occur with respect to this bill. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Minister of Public Utilities.
Mr. Vice President, I am honored once again to stand in this House to support a bill that is long overdue and now more necessary than ever. I want to thank the Independent Senator Shrikissoon for his contribution, and rest assured, as we have shown, that some of his legislative amendments that he is proposing, I'm sure that we will look at them. I also am glad to hear that you are at least recognizing the fact of the financial position that we are in light of the deficit. No one likes to impose taxes, but sometimes we need to. It is necessary based on the time. This property tax amendment bill is this administration attempt to modernize an outdated suite of legislation to standardize the process that they govern and to ensure that they are implemented in an equitable and fair manner. I would like to start by debunking the concept that the collection of property tax is a rare practice and an attempt by this government to impose hardship on citizens and in the process to rob them of their homes or raise revenue by any means necessary, as stated by Senator Mark in his abrupt address. The fact is that contrary to what some of the rhetoric that we have been hearing about property tax, that this is a very legitimate tax. This is a tax that is done not only here, we have had it, it is one that it is necessary, and is one that is actually in most of the countries around the world. It is a very common tax, and actually, as I heard Senator Paula Gopi-Schoon mention, in over 90% of the countries in the world, there is property tax. And in some of these cases, whether they were rich countries, whether they were poor countries, the fact is property tax is a legitimate tax, and as I said, there's over 177 countries in the world actually has that tax. I like to add that property tax is nothing new to Trinidad and Tobago. Previous generations would have paid some form of property tax for decades, and because of subsequent changes to the suite of laws that govern the process and the age of these laws themselves, we now have a convoluted process that is now not equitable. For example, because of the valuation role has not been done for a while, there are property owners in wealthy areas who pay what I call peppercorn monies in property tax, while persons in more recent developments pay more property tax on houses of less value. A property, as we all know what exists in Trinidad, a property right now in Goodwood Park, for example, some of the more older areas will incur a much smaller tax than properties in less value in newer developments like ParlView and Gulfview in South. Therefore, as we strive towards modernizing our society in all areas, we are required to modernize this system of collection property taxes, starting with this governing legislation and the amendments to these legislations that we're proposing. Mr. Vice President, just Tuesday we spoke about modernizing the Parliament. This shift to greater efficiency and streamlining the process must happen across the board if we have to move into the 21st century, and this legislation attempts to help us to do that in this particular essential area. A good example of how this is being done in this particular bill is the measures that are being imposed on how we are going to be looking at taxation of condominiums and townhouses, which was prior to now not being taxed. So, Madam Vice President, as I said in my opening remarks, the government, Mr. Vice President, the government introduction of this tax does not have any sinister intent behind it. It is simply an attempt to fix legislation that is on our books, modernize our country, and bring our legislation and process in line with the other 176 countries around the world that use property tax. Which brings me to the second fallacy that I would like to address, the idea that once implemented, the property tax will be burdensome and oppressive to the less fortunate in our society. And again, it seems like every time we speak about this, this is where we seem to want to go. Mr. Vice President, I would like to use some of my banking techniques, and I want to draw this out to some simple examples that I worked out regarding this whole idea of property tax to deal with that point as relates to the how expensive and the burden that this tax is expected to be brought onto people. I take, for example, I look at a property in Trinidad valued at around $800,000. And I start with that for a particular reason. And based on that value, the projected rent I will apply to that house or rental value is approximately $2,000 a month. All right? So an $800,000 house, and an $800,000 house is a house that requires you to have an income of about $8,450 to get a mortgage for it. You could have probably a security guard and a housekeeper working in MTS. That probably would be their joint income. So both of them go and they got a property. They could actually, based on the provisions that you have under the home mortgage bank and so forth, get a mortgage. The reality is that particular property with a rental value of $2,000 a month will result in a property tax of approximately $54 per month. $54 per month is the tax that we are talking about on an $800,000 property located somewhere and somebody's renting it, has a value of $2,000 per month. I want to use this as a percentage of the person's income, which I think is a reasonable measure that we should use as we talk about this matter being expensive or not. What percentage of your income are you really spending in property tax? And how much does this compare when you look at it in other areas? And that's where I'm going with this argument. That represents approximately 0.6 of your income. Because remember, I said to get that house, you probably need to be working for about $8,400 joint income. So that's your joint income of the person, and that's the percentage. I take a bigger property. Let's say 1.3 million. 1.3 million. And the projected rent on that property, $2,500 per month. Again, to qualify for a mortgage of $1,300, looking at the interest rates in Trinidad and Tobago right now, you need to have a joint income of about $13,700. When you equate the property tax on that, when you're getting a rent of $2,500 on that property, you're talking about $67.50 a month. Or, put another way, 0.5 of 1% of your income. We go on, and we look at a property, $4 million. And we are getting really expensive here now, $4 million. And a $4 million property, projected rent, $12,000 per month. $12,000 per month. So we're getting up. All right? Again, what is the property tax? Approximately $324. Or, again, less than half of 1% of your projected income. And I say that because if you want to have, if you get a mortgage for $4 million to buy a property, all right, your qualifying income has to be about $66,000 a month. $66,000. So two people have to be working for at least $66,000. Again, a property, $2,500. All right? Again, the projected rent, $5,000 a month. And some people do pay rent like that, $5,000 a month. The proposed property tax, $135 per month. Again, in that case, it's 0.3%. So you're talking about generally, Mr. Vice President, these examples show that property tax rate we are proposing are in no way oppressive. Where in some countries, property tax, we are seeing in some countries where on average, I have seen, for example, a similar situation in Barbados. A property, $1.3 million, all right, based on the method that they use for property tax, you will pay $812 per month, and that will represent about 5.4% of your income. You go to Antigua, similar property, $1.3 million, will represent 3% of your income. You go to Canada, a property, $300,000 in Canada, represents, based on their methods of property tax, represents 4.3% of their income. of your income. So let us put the facts square. When you look at property tax around the world, from developed countries to developing countries, to our CARICOM neighbors, to as far as Canada, all right, you are ending up in a situation and you are seeing where property tax normally represents 3, 5 to 6% of your disposable income. That is what colleagues anywhere around the world pays for property tax. In Trinidad and Tobago, what we are proposing is a taxation whereby the property tax based on what you will, based on your rental value of your property, and I've given you some examples, that will result to ranging from 1/4% to 1/2%. We're not talking here percent, we're talking 1/2% of your disposable income. So the concept of people talking about this being, people are going to be losing their properties and so forth, Mr. Vice President, I think is a little bit alarmist, and I think it's one that is tempted to mislead the population with that type of rhetoric. I will even go as far, you know, there's a particular country that we like to all, as a developing country, we all talk about Singapore. And we like to refer to Singapore as our model, as a developing country that has reached developed status in a certain space of time. And therefore, when we look at these places, we like to only talk about the things about them that has happened good. All right? But we also have to measure and look at what they do, or what has happened there. And the concept and the method that they are using for property tax, very similar to ours. It's exactly the same thing, rental value. That is the proposal. The only difference is in Singapore, whereas our rates range from 1 to 6%, and we heard some complaints about the 6%, in that country, the rates range from 4 to 16%. Now, we could say, well, all right, you know, look at that, 4 to 16%. Now, admittedly, the per capita income of Singapore is a little bit more than ours, but I am saying, although their per capita income is about 3 times ours, the rates, even at the lower end, we are moving from 1 to 6, and they are 4 to 16. So, as I said before, Mr. Vice President, let us kill this idea and this discussion about this property tax being oppressive, and that property tax is going to be so high and is going to be a burden on individuals. At this point in time, all right, especially as a result of the fact that in this country, our inflation rates have been checked based on the prudent management. We have inflation here in this country of about 3 to 4%. And therefore, based on the disposable income of the country and the percentage that this tax plays, it is a very reasonable tax. Mr. Vice President, the next point that I would like to talk about is I want to deal with the fact of this tax, having recognized that it is a reasonable, what provisions any government, of course, needs to put protection in place for the less fortunate in the society. And therefore, yes, this might be reasonable to all of us, but what do we have in place in this bill, or what we are proposing with these amendments with regard to dealing with some of the less fortunate? Again, because we want to make sure that no one loses their property. And let's go back and see about what it is that is actually, what is before us. Section 33, for example, makes provision for persons who receive the following to apply for a deferral of property tax: public assistance grant, disability grant, senior citizens, pensioners, or Trinidad and Tobago conditional cash transfer cards. So we have made provision, we have made provision for people who are not in a position to pay, that there would be able to be some deferral. At this point, I would like to support the point made by my colleague, Senator West, who stated, as I quote in the press, that pensioners would not have access to these deferrals. And I think, again, I know so that was something that was put out there, and using, again, other parts of the country. I think I heard Senator Mark said that's what happens in Barbados. I wasn't able to fact check it. But, Madam Vice President, while I understand that we must protect our senior citizens from taxes that might prove to be oppressive to them, we also recognize that the term pensioners covers a broad range of persons, and that some persons who are in receipt of multiple pensions or who would have worked in senior positions during their careers, in some of these cases, the pensions that they receive is even greater than a member of parliament or a cabinet minister's salary. Therefore, the fact that someone is a pensioner does not mean that they cannot afford to pay the property tax. And we have to start, and we have to start in this country to focus our social services, grants, and so on persons who really need them, especially in these times. As we did, as you know, and therefore the concept that was said, and I think my Senator West spoke about it, the concept of putting in means testings, which is something that we did as we worked when we dealt with the GATE program. And we have to make sure that we cannot then have these sweeping things around that says, you know, just exempt a group of people. All right? We have to make sure that we are targeting our social programs to the people who need them. And therefore, we are talking about, and we also have to recognize that these situations, that people's situations, do not always exist forever. And as such, it is important then that we put mechanisms, and this bill attempts to establish a deferral. Section 23(1) attempts to do so by establishing a deferral period of 2 years, after which applicants must reapply to be deemed eligible for further deferrals. So again, we are putting in systems some of the changes that will enhance and ensure that we are targeting the right people, and ensure that we put mechanisms in place so that this fear that people will not be in a position to lose their properties will be, it is just, again, as I said before, rhetoric, and that is no way what our intention is. Mr. Vice President, an additional safeguard to ensure that those who need exemption from tax gets them is proposed in Clause 6. This clause amends Section 16D of the Property Tax Act, Chapter 76, verse 04, and provides exemption for property tax for charities exempted from corporation tax under Section 61G. Another amendment to this time, Section 21, subsection 12 of the Act, allow for the offsetting of an overpayment of property tax against other taxes owed to the state. The owner would also be entitled to a refund of property tax in the circumstances where there has been an overpayment. We are proposing another amendment to the same section, which allows the owner who fails to file an objection within the time frame and has a reasonable excuse for not doing so, to apply to the Board on Inland Revenue for an exemption of time. This, of course, would be a benefit to the property owners. And then there's an amendment which helps to make the process more efficient. Clause 10 of the bill, for example, amends Section 21, which deals with the objections to assessments. It states that an objection to an assessment is required to be filed within 21 days after receipt of the notice of assessment, rather than after the tax becomes due and payable. This, of course, helps things to flow more smoothly and make the system more efficient. With respect to the appeals process, this is now being moved to the valuation of Land Act, where this is now being moved to the Valuation Appeal Board rather than the Tax Appeal Board, which we have all recognized will allow for it to happen a lot faster. So you can see, Mr. Vice President, that safeguards are being put in place to protect the interests of the property owners and to ensure that the systems flow as efficiently and as smoothly as possible for all involved. Indeed, the nature of the property tax itself and the way it relates to the Valuation of Land Act is meant to standardize and simplify the entire process, from the valuation of the property to the collection of the tax on that property. Again, we have heard some people talk about the fact that this is a very convoluted system and that it is not simple and people will then get confused. Again, I don't share that. I don't share that view. I have heard when my colleagues, while speaking on the valuation, speaking about the property tax in that particular manner. So I am preempting them again. If you look at it, this is a very straightforward, this is a very clear system. This is a one where the process is very transparent. You do a valuation, you look at the rental of your property, the annual rentable value. There's a 3% for residential, 5% for commercial, 6% in some cases for industrial where plants and machinery are housed, etc., etc. So, Mr. Vice President, we clearly are trying in this property tax and this amendment. The facts are that this is not anything new. This is not a tax that one is looking at trying to impose on this country that is going to, because we want to take people properties, or we want to impose anything that is too burdensome. We have also ensured via the amendments that we have had and the original act that there are sufficient provisions for people to get deferrals, and we have given them the appropriate time frames and simplified that process as much as possible. We have also tried to make the system very simple and transparent so that everyone would be able to comply and be able to, so that no one would be able to say that they do not understand the process. But you know, there was a point again made by our independent senator earlier, and he talked about it is unfortunate that we have to impose taxes like this to try to raise funds because of some of the levels of reckless spending that was incurred by over the last 5 years. When you look at how it is we got to this position, whereby we have to, right? You know, Madam, please protect me. Mr. Vice President, it is important, you know, there's an African proverb that I always use, and it really says, to forget is the same as to throw away. All right? You have to remember at all points in time, and I share the point, that if we had inherited an economy right, based on what Trinidad and Tobago, what was left, and based on all the resources that Trinidad and Tobago have, we would not have been in this position. But I want to remind us, what did we have to inherit? We inherited an economy, Mr. Vice President, where we, in 2010, we left a situation whereby there was a $6 billion credit, $6 billion credit in the central bank account, the government account, $6 billion. There was over $16 billion and more in the NGC's account. At that time, when we left in 2010, the level of debt in this country was $45 billion. Those are the facts. Those are the facts. During the period, all right, of between 2010, all right, to 2015, you had a situation where the average price of oil averaged was $98 a barrel. Facts. That is the fact. With that, what did we get when we came back in 2015? Again, fact. We met an account with negative $9 million in overdraft. The same account, billion, right? The same account that that at the point in time was in credit. We met a debt. Debt had moved to over $75 billion. And most of all, the nice safeguard NGC account, which I've heard some people say, no, it really wasn't 16, it was 12, it was 11, it was 14. The reality is, it was in credit, it was 16 based on the accounts, and now we have now gotten it dry, empty.
Well, it's still paying. We still
right?
100 million. It's still quite 100 per year.
Mr. Vice President, the fact is that over the past year, this government, that previous government, licked up over $62 billion in cash. That's the fact, all right? And during that time, we had budgets that came to this house in the vicinity of $63 billion, $59 billion, $54 billion. Those are the types of money and expenditure that was brought to this house. And in spite of all of that money, when we came back, yes, if they had done all of that, in addition to utilizing all of the cash, we still ended up in a situation whereby there were still so many accounts at WASA, that is still so many contractors that are unpaid. We ended up with the public service back pay still having to be paid. We ended up with a number of wage negotiations still not completed. So, Mr. Vice President, you cannot, when we want to talk about property tax, and when we want to talk about the impact on the economy, and when we want to talk about the burden to citizens, we have to put that into context of our present financial situation. This is not a situation that we didn't want to be in a position like this. When you look at some of the data that was presented by the ministry, and they looked at a situation whereby this is an idea of what has happened to our revenue. We are operating in a situation, Mr. Vice President, whereby 85% of our income from the oil sector, all right, has dropped off. That is our reality. That is our reality. As a banker, when I came, if I had a customer that came into a situation like that, I first will ask him, do you expect this to be a permanent situation? Are we going to be operating? Do you expect to get some income coming back soon? And to Trinidad and Tobago, I think we all agree that the days of $100 a barrel oil is something of the past, right? We have to learn to live. We have been seeing some blitz up recently, all right? But we have to learn to live within the range of where the oil prices are now. Therefore, as a good banker, everyone will tell you what we have to do is to cut your cloth to suit your style. You have to cut your cloth to suit your style. Again, we have to put this property tax, we have to put these taxation measures. And it's all well and good for people to say, or the members of the opposition, to talk about the fact that you all are doing this and taxing the people here and taxing the people here. There. The reality is, right, this is the government. When you are faced with this situation, you have to cut your cloth to suit your style. And you have a few levers that you could push, you know, Mr. Vice President. You have a few levers you could push. Now, you could single out this measure, and you could single out that measure, and you could single out the other measure. And you could talk about them in isolation. But it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work like that. I have seen some recommendations, and they will say, don't devalue. They will say, no job losses. They will say, no utilization of the savings. Everything is no, no, no. Each one of the things are not, nobody wants to do these things. But you have certain levers that you could push. As a government, we have taken a position that the lever regarding devaluing this currency is not going to be beneficial to the poor. It's not going to give us the type of relief that we want. And therefore, we have decided to take a hold on that lever. So we have 4 levers. We hold one lever and we say, no, we're not moving that lever. You have the other lever. You could decide, listen to me, you have less expenditure. You have to cut your cloth to suit your income. You heard Senator talked about the fact of the deficit that we face. We have income of 37 million. What do? You could then decide to cut expenditure. We have done that. We have cut a lot of the fat. We have moved from 63 down to 50. And you could decide to cut even further. But what will that happen when you decide to cut further? If you cut further, you'll be cutting into people's jobs. All right? And this government, as much as possible, is trying to keep that unemployment level at a decent level. We are a country who talks about crime. If we increase that unemployment level higher and we play that lever, so people who are saying, listen to me, all right, don't do this, don't do any taxes. What you are in effect saying, if you want to move that lever, you don't want to move that lever, rest assured you will be called upon to have to move other levers. So we have taken a position that we are not moving that lever. It therefore leaves us with 1 or 2 other options, having decided that those 2 levers we want to keep. We have to look at how we could increase our revenue. And we have to look at other ways of raising that revenue. And I make no apologies, Mr. Vice President, that property tax is going to help us along that line. Now, a lot of people have argued that it's going to be a small amount. I hear Senator Mark talk about it's actually going to be a big amount. In my case, the more the merrier. Because the truth of the matter is, the more that we could get from property tax, and I have no problem.
Senator, you have 5 minutes.
I have no problem with individuals who have big properties and people who are living in houses paying more in property tax, and I'm able to collect a little bit more. It means, therefore, when I have a little bit more, I will then be able to not to be able to fund there are a lot more of the social services that I want to keep. So, Mr. Vice President, it's a balancing act. It's a balancing act. This property tax falls under the realm of us trying as we attempt to balance this and we attempt to transition this economy from where it's at to one whereby we are bringing it down gradually with adjustments This is an attempt, or one of the attempts, for us to increase revenue. Is this the only thing that we are doing? No, Mr. Vice President. We are also looking at trying to increase the tax efficiency in the country, and you will see other legislation to come to this House to talk about how are we going to collect more revenue from people who are evading tax, and that is to come. So we can't, again, don't take this in isolation. This is the only thing that we are doing. No, we are doing other things. Are we looking at cutting expenditure? Of course we are. We brought it down from 63 down to 50, and we are looking at other measures to keep our expenditure down. So you cannot then take property tax, and I like the position, as I said, going by Senator Taurel, when he brought it into context, right? And it is important that you put this into context. We do not particularly like going out and taxing. We had to do it with the financial services, where we put on a special tax because we are about spreading the adjustment to all. And this must be looked at in this context. In summary, again, in the midst of doing that, in the midst of spreading the adjustment, all right, based on our present circumstances, all right, we are still doing that in a very, what I will consider in a very humane manner. We did not impose a tax that is going to be onerous or very onerous, all right? No, it is not going to be very onerous. I have shown you that as a percentage of disposable income, it is one of the lowest property taxes when you look at it. Of all the 177 countries that have property tax in the world, this rate is one of the lowest from as a percentage of disposable income. We have measures in this bill to protect the people and the less fortunate who are unable to pay the tax. We have done that. And this is a time where where the country has a deficit, Mr. Vice President. If we don't take the time, if we don't make these adjustments ourselves, we are going to eventually, like other countries in the Caribbean, find ourselves one day falling off the cliff. We have to decide as responsible people to make these adjustments for ourselves, failing which other individuals and other people are going to force these adjustments onto us. So, property tax, small as it may be, it is going to help this government in increasing revenue. Property tax is something that we put a system in place, that it is important that people know that you have a property and you have to pay for it. In 2013, when oil prices were up as high as $98 or $97, the previous Minister of Finance felt that property tax, it was the time for it to happen then. Mr. Vice President, now where the oil prices have fallen, I don't think he even anticipated it will fall so low. I cannot find the adjective to describe what it is, should be, why we should need it now. And if we need it then, we need it now more than ever. I therefore, again, look forward to all supporting this much needed change. Thank you very much.
Senator Ameen.
Mr. Vice President, I was appalled when I heard the minister in the Ministry of Finance say $500 is nothing. And today, hearing the contribution of the speaker before me, Honorable Minister Hunt, it is clear even more so now, that this government is insensitive, ungrounded, unrealistic, callous, and totally uncaring. I listened to the minister who would have had the good fortune of having income significantly over what he was describing, where a cleaner and a security guard whose combined income of $8,000 could afford them a mortgage for a house valued at about $700,000 or $800,000. Clearly, these people would not be paying. These people who he described, not the minister, these people who he described, the cleaner and the security guard, certainly would not be sending any children to school, would not be buying food with increased VAT prices, would not be paying any higher purchase, would not be paying any electricity bill, any utilities or anything like that. So, you know, Mr. Vice Chairman, I grew up in a very poor family, and I still belong to a very poor family. And when I hear people who have lived lives with 5-figure incomes try to describe what a security guard and a cleaner what their household income might earn them, you know, stick to what you know. It's better you stick to what you know. You are totally out of touch with the reality of thousands of people in this country. Mr. Vice President, and as I begin my contribution, there are a few things I want to respond to what the minister said before I go on to the meat of my contribution. The minister continued with the P&M rhetoric of blame UNC, blame UNC. After 3 years in government, I want to remind you of what the People's Partnership, what the UNC inherited in 2010.
And not a single property.
And in that time, we didn't have to increase any property tax. Mr. Vice President, the former P&M government spent $30 million on a mystery church that ended up collapsing. They left a $25 billion CLICO debt to be cleared up by the UNC government. They were owing contractors $2 billion. You had that debacle of the Tobago, the Scarborough Hospital, where so much material mysteriously went missing. That famous landed fiasco. You had over 75 unsettled wage negotiations. You had the Taruba Stadium. You had, and some of the debts included from Housing Development Corporation, $12 million. The Airports Authority, over $478 million. The PTSC, $26 million. WASA, $206 million. The Regional Health Authorities, $2 million. National Securities, $11 million. And the Urban Development Corporation of Trinidad and Tobago.
Who was that member?
A board on which the Honorable Minister served as a director. $3.4 billion. And you ask why we had to increase borrowing. And it is on record in the Commission of Inquiry into the Las Alturas debacle. It is on record the role the gentleman who now serves as Minister of Public Utilities played in that scandal in waste,
46.6
and mismanagement.
46.6.
Let's just not...
Good contribution.
Happy to hear.
Are you done?
Well, I cut it into my time, you know.
Senator, I want to remind you of the standing orders of imputing improper motives on a sitting member of the Senate. Okay? So just continue your contribution and just be careful.
Oh, certainly, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Vice President. But just to let you know, I wasn't imputing anything about the minister's motive. I was just indicating what is on public record. and that is a fact in terms of the waste, corruption, and mismanagement of the UDCOT, including when certain directors were there. Mr. Vice President, the logic of put forward thus far by the two speakers on the government side so far in this debate seems to be, one, because you can afford an all-inclusive Fed ticket, you can pay property tax. First of all, the Minister and the Ministry of Finance did make that suggestion during her contribution, just in case you missed it. First of all, not everyone could afford all-inclusive tickets. And the presumption by those in authority that that is something they take for granted, that that is affordable by any person, again points to how disconnected they are from reality. Yes. Property tax applies to everyone. But the fact is that there are thousands of people in this country living below the poverty line. There are pensioners. There are about 60,000 pensioners who live on their $3,500 a month pension grant from the Ministry of Social Services. There are thousands, I understand about 15,000 persons who are differently abled who receive disability grant of $18,000 per month. There are an increasing number of unemployed persons, thanks to this government, who are causing people to be losing their jobs more and more every day. And, Mr. Vice President, even for those who earn $6,000 a month, they are struggling to make ends meet. But there are thousands who earn less than that. Single-parent families, single-income homes. So while there may be a few very fortunate retired, let's say, bank managers who would get two-thirds of the salary they last worked as their pension, which might take them up to about $40,000 or $50,000 as their pension. A teacher who gets a pension from the Teaching Service Commission gets about $7,000. Who is in the majority? So the very few people who might be entitled to, quite handsome pensions, I'm happy for them. They would have worked out, they would have served. But a cleaner who works with MTS or worked with MTS would get a little kakada from National Insurance Board. They would then, if your records in NIS doesn't allow you to qualify for a pension, you would then get the pension grant from social services, the Ministry of Social Development, my apologies. But, Mr. Vice President, the argument has been put forward, not that property tax should not be paid, but that any tax that should be paid must be fair, and it must be fair to all, and it must be well thought out. I think one of the main sentiments that comes from people who are objecting to the property tax brought by this government at this time is that now is simply not the time for it based on what the citizens are facing. And the hardships being faced by hardships faced by citizens now has in large part to do with the incompetence and the ineffectiveness of this government. Mr. Vice President, I think, when under a previous government, there was an Axi-Tax campaign. And Mr. Prakash Ramada was the main player in that. And he said, and I think this just captures it very well. He said in Parliament in 2007, so that was just last year, he said this country is overtaxed already, and that tax to homes where persons have lost
Senator,
jobs.
I mean, just now, you said 2017 you're trying to say, and is the Hansard record you're reading from? So do you have a date to go with that?
Oh no, this is on Newsday.
It's on you, right, so.
Yes.
Yeah. Just give the name of the article, the newspaper, the date.
So this is Newsday of June 11 to 2017. And the title of the article is Times Too Tough to Pay Property Tax. So as I was quoting, he said, this country is overtaxed already, and to tax homes where persons have lost jobs and are fearful of losing their jobs. Many who are working live on the edge, where their disposable income is minimal, and put that fear factor in the one place where you are supposed to be comfortable. I do not believe that we should pursue property taxation. And that, Madam, Mr. Vice President, seems to be the one thing that this government wishes to close their eyes to. Many of the taxes that Mr. Ramada referred to in terms of being overtaxed are taxes imposed by this government, either directly, most without consultation or consideration. And one in particular that I feel happened, people were deceived because the promise was to reduce VAT. And what they did in fact do is increase VAT from 15% to 12.5%, but increase the number of items that VAT was charged on, and effectively having a net increase on what the population pays in terms of VAT. That was a great deception that was perpetrated on this country. Over 10,000 items went from 0% to 12.5% in VAT. Madam Vice President, Mr. Vice President, I want to go into some of the reasons why it is my belief that one of my biggest beliefs is that now is not the time, based on the present situation, to bring another new tax. But my first question to this government, you are yet to indicate what your purpose of this tax is. We know that it is to bring revenue for you. Revenue to buy more boats, revenue to buy more paintings, revenue to buy more Mercedes-Benz. Tell us. Revenue to groom golf courses? Yes. What is the purpose of your property tax? And I want to read some pieces from an article entitled Tax Law Design and Drafting from the International Monetary Fund. And it more or less gives guidance to countries when they are drafting and designing law to tax property. Introduction. The primary reasons for imposing a property tax include incentives for efficient land use. Does your tax do that? A tax base that cannot be withdrawn from production. Establishment of an autonomous revenue source for local government. Does your tax do that? And the UNC has spoken on many occasions about what we feel an appropriate tax when it comes to property, to land and buildings, and what it should be. And to me, I believe that your purpose of your tax must be very clear. Where it is going, you must be very clear. So you must tell the population why you want to have a tax. Because the fact is that, I mean, we know that there are many countries in the world where property tax is par for the course. But I am saying you cannot have an unfair tax and expect everyone to pay for it, for your mistakes and your misjudgments. So why are you having a property tax? A tax must have some objective, some fiscal, some political, or some legal objective. And it's critical to identify those for any sort of collection that you are going to do. And my question to this government, have you identified your purpose for this taxation? Please don't tell us it is just revenue to go to the consolidated fund. That is not a good enough justification. These are also recommendations from the IMF advising on drafting, designing property tax laws. A property tax is often designed to provide an independent source of local government finance, whether or not collected and administrated locally. So the regional corporations do not necessarily have to administrate the tax. But the proceeds would go to them. A tax on land and building offers a revenue base that, unlike sales, payroll, or income, cannot readily shift to a neighboring jurisdiction. So even if there is a central or national body collecting the taxes based on the amounts received from within a particular region, that funding will go to that region, and it can, in fact, be supplemented by revenue from the consolidated fund when the budget does come around. However, the benefit justification has important limitations. Often the properties that place the highest burdens on local services and pose the greatest fire and safety risks are poorly maintained structures of low value. More expensive buildings may be better maintained, built more recently under more exacting safety standards and even protected by private security arrangements, and we have seen that. An equally limited but politically significant justification rests on the ability to pay, demonstrated in part by the ownership of valuable property. So many of the recommendations argue against a government having any excessive reliance on property tax, but not against having a property tax in itself. Mr. Vice President, one of the roles of a property tax is it will also define property rights.
Senator, let me just offer a little guidance. I, for the most part, would have allowed you to, mostly in response to speakers that have gone before you, speak on the generality and the general principles of the property tax. It's about halfway through your contribution, and I'm yet to hear you refer to any of the clauses in the bill specifically. Other speakers, even though they would have spoken about the general principles, at some point would have tied it into the actual clauses. So I would ask at this point that if you have any points that would speak on the actual clauses and the bill in front of us, that you could move on to those. You have given arguments and points in relation to the general principles. So could you move on to the amendments in the bill that is proposed to the actual Property Tax Act that has been passed already?
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me just, for clarification, indicate that I was responding to speakers who went before, and I know that that is part of debate. We respond to those speakers who have gone before. So I have my points, the notes that I took during the debate, and I have my points that are based on the actual.
I understand. The thing is that that's why I said I allowed you for at least half of your contribution so far in terms of time to respond to the general principles put forward. Everybody's talking on the general principles of the property tax as it relates to this debate. What I'm asking you to do now is to at least mention a clause or two in the bill, because you're going to end up speaking for 40 minutes on the general principles, which is not what is supposed to happen. So continue.
Okay, Mr. Vice President, I want to refer to something that the minister said. Listen. Mr. Vice President, everybody has their own speaking style, right? And there are people who will refer to clause by clause and go on it. I really want to I really want to speak. It's not just about the general merits of the bill and so on, Mr. Vice President. And I'm not going to be deceptive by just calling a clause number, but if it satisfies you, oh, sorry, well, let me don't put it like that. Let me don't put it like that. In order to satisfy the requirement that you have put forward, Mr. Vice President, that would be so deceptive.
Yes, unlike the theater.
Mr. Vice President, one of the headlines in the newspaper was that squatters will have to pay for property tax. Squatters will have to pay for property tax. And this is not something, that is not a new headline or a new issue that has come up. And yeah, no, I have it here. So so while I want to refer to the article that was recently reported what the Minister in the Ministry of Finance indicated in her contribution on the last day when we started debate on this matter, I remember that in May of 2017, the government had indicated, this was a Guardian article, the government had indicated that it was seeking legal advice to examine whether squatters on private land and those with buildings on state land will have to pay tax. And that was put forward by the Minister of Finance, Honorable Colm Imbert, and he said that the Attorney General had asked the Solicitor General to examine the matter. And he indicated at that time that a squatter that has a building on land they don't own, they may have to pay property tax for the building, but not the land. And the Attorney General claimed the squatters with certificates of comfort for property may also have to pay property tax. Mr. Vice President, in the bill before us, the minister indicates that the state collecting taxes does not give title to the person who is paying the taxes. All right? Part of the purpose of a property tax is to define property type, property rights. So the role of property tax in defining property rights may be among its most significant contributions to the economy in transition. The World Bank said this. One often overlooked when the levy is considered solely as a fiscal instrument. And I feel that the government is erring by considering this property tax solely as a fiscal instrument, solely for generating revenue, and overlooking the issue of property rights. I feel that you cannot, having worked with numerous squatter regularization exercises under different administrations, I feel that we cannot speak about property tax and about taxing squatters if you are not going to regularize squatters. And since the inception of this government's term, they seem to have stopped the regularization, and I want to plead with the government to resume regularization of squatters so that you will have law and order and public health and all the other advantages within those communities. There are also, Mr. Vice President, clarification of a continuing public claim upon a portion of land in the form of an annual tax can reconcile those competing positions. So apart from squatters, there are situations, and there are members of the government who are aware of situations where, for example, lands had been rented by the state previously. I know of the estate of Badis Sagan Maraj, which then went to the state, and his tenants, people who were renting his land in Page, remained paying the rent to the state. And after he died and his estate passed to the state, no documents were ever given to them. And for a short time, they did get a temporary leases, and they are entitled to the land. They are not squatters. They have a public claim, a continuing public claim on these lands. But it is for the state and the government to ensure that if you are going to impose a property tax, that it is fair to them and that they have title to the land. So when the minister spoke earlier about the fact that squatters will have to pay and that it does not give them title, those are matters to be considered. You cannot simply think about the fiscal benefits alone. Mr. Vice President, Madam President, I want to go to some other issues. And these are issues put forward in the same paper, tax law design and drafting from International Monetary Fund. Issues to be considered when drafting: a practical evaluation of any proposed legislation must examine questions such as: 1, how is the system of identifying properties and taxpayers coordinated with current land and property records? What agencies will be responsible for maintaining this information? And we have the CSO, we have lands and surveys, we have some information in the regional corporation, and I want to just come back to that, to the regional corporations a little later in detail. But this is a review of property taxation in Trinidad and Tobago, which was based on the Ministry of Planning and Development report of 1990. This was a land use policy administration project of May 2000. And it spoke about the state of records relevant to the efficient administration of property tax and the fact that it is unsatisfactory. They spoke about Town and Country Planning Division of the Ministry of Housing and Settlements at that time had produced plans for the regional and sub-regional towns in accordance with their statutes. And we know that local area development plans had been done for all regional corporations in about 2008, 2009, and they were adopted when the People's Partnership came into government. They were adopted. So those local plans remain in effect. What role does this property tax have in fitting into those local development plans? They were called spatial development plans. The Central Statistic Office, the CSO, the Office of the Prime Minister, also maintains a spatial database on buildings and occupants at the enumeration district level for this aggregation. The data of the CSO is computerized, including the electoral district maps, which are digitized, in addition to the Town and Country Planning Division and CSO, Lands and Surveys Division of the Ministry of Housing and Settlements at that time, a source of maps and aerial photographs. No mechanisms currently exist to link the records on the assessment role of the Valuation Division. This was outlined as an issue way back, as I say, in May 2000, a land use policy administration project. And the question today...
Senator Ameen, so I just need to reinforce this point that your contribution is based on property tax. There is an act in place already. There is an amendment bill before the House. And I need for you to address some of the issues in the bill because you've given quite a bit of context already.
President, I was dealing with the issue that came up with the records in terms of the property role, but where they spoke about the evaluation, once you do half of the country, you would have the
Isn't that Senator Ameen?
No.
Wasn't that, sorry, could you just have a seat? Wasn't that in the last preceding bill that we just completed?
Okay, Madam Vice President, thank you. What? Excuse me? My time is not up. Don't tell me to sit down. Madam President, I want to move to clause 17, where they spoke about the moratorium with respect to the property taxes, and where it was initially the 30th of September 2018. And then we had in this thing that came before us, the 30th of September 2016. Madam Vice President, Madam President, it is my view that the government does not have the mechanisms in place, the state mechanisms in place, to begin fairly collecting any property tax. And to put this retroactive in 2016 adds an increased burden on the citizens. The question with regards to any sort of fine, any sort of punishment, is to ask, will the interest and penalty provisions encourage a reasonable level of compliance? This is a new tax. You want to encourage people to pay their property tax. There are other countries who give they give a little discount when you pay early. And this punitive approach by the government for this period from 2016 to present, and then later on if you default in any way, Madam President, I feel we could do a little better than that. And I just want to refer to, I think this is in Florida, Palm Beach County. Taxes are due and payable on the 1st of November or as soon as the tax is received. An early payment discount of 4% is available for taxes paid in November, 3% discount for taxes paid in December, and 2% for taxes paid in January, and 1% for taxes paid in February. So this is a suggestion that we could take into consideration. And let's be proactive. Let's encourage people to pay on time rather than be punitive and retroactive in terms of punishing people who have made late payments. But even when you do have this, this period from which you will begin the taxation, I want to suggest that we leave it at the 2018. All right. So, Madam Vice President, I want to move to some recommendations. I mentioned that my strong view that property tax, the proceeds of any property tax or land and building taxes should go to the local authorities. I have a few examples and a few models that I refer to. I mentioned the incentives in the Palm Beach County, but there are also, the Canadians had some, I think, some points that we could incorporate in our bill if we are going to do that. And I want to again call on the government where in terms of clause 5 with regards to not giving, to provide any liability, to provide that any liability to the property tax by the owner of any building or other chattel does not create a legal entitlement to the land. This obtains mostly for squatters and where the owner of the chattel is not the legal owner of the land. Madam Vice President, the provisions for exemptions, clause 6, the provisions for the exemptions from property tax for charities exempted under the corporation taxes, and approved charitable, for approved charitable purposes. Madam Vice President, I have a concern with that. Madam President, I have a concern with that.
You have 5 more minutes.
All right. There are a number of people who can register organizations simply to escape the property tax, and the mechanisms of the government has to be strong in terms of checking on those things. Madam President, the other point I want to raise has to do with the valuation division in terms of who is responsible for the valuations presently. Madam Vice President, these taxes will be based on assessments. I am not satisfied that the persons who are trained to be assessors to decide on the tax that people will pay are suitably qualified, and I trust that somebody on the other side could explain that to us. I want to ask the government if they could tell us how long they think it would take to establish the proper staffing and the administrative structure to properly and effectively and efficiently collect these taxes. There are a number of taxes, and every year in the budget, when we look at the return of revenue, you see the estimated tax in terms of the projected, what they expected to collect, what the state expected to collect, and what they do in fact collect. And it's very often less than half, less than 50%. And that inefficiency in collecting taxes, I fear, will come across to this property tax simply because the mechanisms are not in place at the ministry, and where you have this new. Madam President, I am of the belief that this moratorium should. Okay.
Thank you, Madam President. In accordance with Standing Order 14.5, I beg to move that the Senate continue to sit until 9 p.m.
Honourable Senators, the question is if this Senate do continue to sit until 9 p.m.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there's a proposed new section, Section 20, any amount of a refund under subsection 1A that remains outstanding for more than a period of 6 months after the date by which it is due shall bear interest. Madam Vice President, I want to compare that to Section 21, where the basically, they could owe you, but you can't owe them. And I find that unfair. If I have to pay a penalty for a late payment, then if the state or the state agency owes me as a taxpayer monies, and they have not paid for beyond the time recommended here to pay, then you should be paying me interest. So I find that rather unfair. Madam President, in my 2 minutes to wrap up, my 1 minute to wrap up, I want to indicate that there is nothing wrong with a property tax, but a property tax must have a specific purpose that will directly benefit the people of the local region. This tax does not have that. A property tax must be fair. This tax is not fair. A property tax must exist in a framework that is accountable and transparent, and this tax does not do that. I am not prepared to support property tax at all in this form.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, this particular act, an act to amend the Property Tax Act, reminds me of the play Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. The play is finished and the Danish prince is yet to make an appearance. Let me focus on the clauses that I would like to address, and then I would recommend what I consider to be the appearance of the substantive element. Madam President, Clause 5. It is of concern to me because Clause 5 states that there is no legal entitlement to any land upon which the chattel is located where the owner of the chattel is not the legal owner of the land. What is of concern to me, Madam President, is that when someone pays a tax, he is complying with the law. When a tax is levied on someone or where he occupies, the state has implicitly agreed that this person is liable to tax. Is it that we are at a stage now where it is okay to tax illegal activities? I always thought squatting was illegal in Trinidad and Tobago because there is an issue known as moral hazard. If you want to collect more property taxes, simply encourage a lot more people to be squatters, and we collect the taxes there. So, Madam President, I am a little bit concerned where the state is actually benefiting from an illegal activity. So that's Clause 5. And I would hope, Madam President, as a matter of public policy, that this particular tax will be levied on persons who may be deemed to be squatters but who have letters of comfort, and therefore there is some legitimate expectation that at some time they may arrange to have title on the land. Madam President, another clause. Clause 15, and in particular 15.2. A couple hours ago, we concluded the debate on the valuation of land amendment. But what 15.2 says is that a person who has objected to his assessment under Section 21 and who is dissatisfied with the decision of the board may appeal to the Tax Appeal Board in accordance with the provision of the Tax Appeal Board Act. I thought that, Madam President, was over and done with. And therefore, the drafters will have to look at 15.2. It is true, I understand the conundrum. It is true that the Valuation of Land Act has not been assented to, and therefore we can't put it in the legislation. But I cannot say I will agree to a piece of law where 2 hours ago we repealed 15.2. So that I'm sure the drafters will find a way around that. It should be, may appeal to the Valuation Tribunal in accordance with the provision of the Valuation Tribunal Board Act, but the reality is that has not been assented to. So this will have to be addressed in my mind by the drafters. Madam President, Clause 23. It says that there is some retroactivity to 2016, but one would have thought that the government would indicate quite clearly to this Honorable House why they intend to reverse or to go back 2 years from September 2018 to September 2016 to collect these outstanding taxes. Why not 3? What is the reason for collecting taxes from September the 30th, 2016? It would appear that it was just done without much thinking because maybe 2 years seemed to be a reasonable amount. But I would recommend for consideration that if the legislation is passed, that out of equity and fairness, we levy this particular tax 30th of September and we change 2016 to 2018. And I leave that for the government. But, Madam President, my concern with the amendment is that I was expecting to see a clause in here, and I am proposing it. I was expecting to see a clause in here to address what I consider to be the major concern of the entire society. The Honorable Minister of Public Utilities, when he addressed us a short while ago, indicated to us an African proverb that I think is very telling. To forget is the same as to throw away. Well, it is important for us not to forget what happened to Margaret Thatcher in 1979 when she tried to impose a poll tax. Despite what was advised, she lost support from her own party. And so, Madam President, and to forget what happened in 2010 as well, public sentiment is very much against this. And I want to indicate quite clearly, every single citizen of Trinidad and Tobago should look forward to paying his property tax. But, and there's a caveat. You see, Madam President, and I'm coming to what I consider to be the essential point that ought to have been addressed, given what we learned from 2010 and what we are trying to do 8 years later. In piloting the bill, and I'm grateful to Parliament staff for making available to me the Hansard transcript of the Honorable Minister in the Ministry of Finance. The Honorable Minister indicated the following: having regard to all of those burdens that impact significantly the revenue that we are currently receiving, we can no longer afford to not collect property tax. Senator Shrikissoon, in his budget contribution, urged the Ministry of Finance, through me, to try to balance the budget. We cannot balance the budget without collecting additional revenue. We cannot. So in that context, Madam President, we are obliged to operationalize this legislation. This means, Madam President, that there is an objective of the property tax from the government. It is stated quite clearly, and the objective is to balance the budget. I, of course, disagree with the Honorable Minister who indicated that we cannot balance the budget without collecting additional revenue. You can balance by cutting expenditure too, and you can balance by increasing collections, so that the property tax, to my mind, as government's policy, as stated by the Honorable Minister, to fill the fiscal deficit is where the concern lies. There is, of course, another issue I have had with the minister she piloted, and when she indicated, with your leave, Madam President, I'm quoting from the Hansard transcript. So as I said, Senator Mark indicated during his debate that was supposed to be related to valuation, to comment on the fact that Barbados gave all pensioners a 50% relief. I think that our version of the relief is superior to that because, as I indicated, a pensioner does not mean somebody who cannot afford. A pensioner just means you have retired from employment. I will return to that in the subsequent part of my presentation. But, Madam President, I think a clause is missing from this bill, you see. And the clause, it's something that Senator Ameen alluded to, and that is, let us be sure about what it is. And we are amending, you see. We're amending a legislation. Why are we amending? We're amending to put right certain things that may not have been right in a previous incarnation. My proposal for a new clause 3, we said, Clause 1 in the amended bill says, this act may be cited as a property tax amendment bill 2018. Clause 2 says, in this act, the act means the Property Tax Act. And I would recommend for the consideration of the Honorable, for the government, that there is a clause 3 which states that the revenue derived from the property tax shall be used exclusively to finance the operations of local government bodies in Trinidad. Not Trinidad and Tobago, because Tobago has its own arrangements with respect to the transfer of some 4.1% to 6.9% from the central government. So my proposal would be, and this is where we would be able to eliminate a lot of the discord and the disharmony which arose in the past and which I suspect may arise in the future. the revenue derived from the property tax shall be used exclusively to finance the operations of local government bodies in Trinidad. I know this goes against the grain of government's stated policy. But, Madam President, I fear if we do not do this, we may lose the chance of doing two things: collecting revenue which is due to the state, and second, and I would like the entire country to support the government on this measure. Let us pay to the government this particular tax, but let us dedicate this particular tax to the financing of local government operations. Why am I saying this, Madam President? You see, you have to ask yourself, what is the difference between this particular tax and the income tax or the expenditure taxes that we have? This is a tax on wealth. You see, it's a peculiar one. And Senator Mark, in his contribution, was alluding to what a member indicated, current Prime Minister, as to what ought to be the purpose for this tax. A wealth tax is always going to be problematic. And one may ask, Madam President, why not tax all wealth? Why only tax property? It is possible, isn't it, that we could ask someone to give us a list of all his mutual funds, his stocks, his bonds, his monetary instruments, his currency, and we can tax a percentage of that. It's possible we could do that, but we don't. There's a good reason for that. We don't tax monetary wealth because of the double taxation argument. It was accumulated because from, do you want me to give away? Oh, yeah. It is wealth accumulated after there was a tax on a flow. And so if you were to tax monetary wealth, it's double taxation. The argument has always been, why don't we tax then the flow from that wealth, which was interest income? And there was a tax, Madam President, on interest income in Trinidad, and I was an instrumental figure in persuading then Minister of Finance, Brian Kwaitong, Honorable Brian Kwaitong, that it should be removed because any tax on interest income is a disincentive to savings, which will injure capital accumulation in a developing economy, and that will stymie economic growth. That tax was removed. But, Madam President, why is there then this justification and rationale for the property tax? And the reason is simple. Owners of properties benefit from services supplied by the state. But which services? Is it defense services? No, that's general revenue. It is garbage collection, it is the clearing of water courses, it is parks, it is the various services associated with the amenities in a local government locale. And because properties are located in a locale, I know it is tautological, it is argued that the beneficiaries there should pay for the cost. And, Madam President, there is a long history of the property tax. The Minister of Public Utilities indicated that the rate in Canada is very high, something like 4% and so on. And what he did not indicate of the 170 countries or so which have implemented this tax, how many of them use the tax for central government financing and how many of them use that for local? Yes.
Madam President, I thank Senator Mahabir for giving way. I see everybody's speaking about municipalities as it's a municipal tax. And in principle, during the local government reform, we are committed to that. Yes. I will be speaking later on in the debate, so I don't want to take up too much time. But I'll be covering how we plan to implement the local government reform process in the context of the property tax.
I thank the Honorable Minister. And this is music, Madam President, to hear, because finally we are getting to target the tax to where it ought to be. Because you see, the history is we should learn from something known as the philosophy of the tax. And I always thought that the local government legislation should have come first, the valuation amendment coming second, and the property tax coming third, in that sequence. You see, Madam President, there are two bases, and I must confess. Yeah, I must confess in that at the PhD level, public finance was one of my specialties. And I never practiced. Today is the only day in my career I'm getting a chance to demonstrate my knowledge of this area, having written papers on the thing. Madam President, there are two criteria. The criteria is one, ability to pay and benefit. There are two criteria. And we tax wealth, although the wealth has been accumulated out of after-tax income too. There is good reason to avoid the double taxation argument because of the benefit criterion. And I expected the Minister of Local Government to have been a critical person in this debate because, you see, with my proposed amendment, every 5 cents, because cents are now going to be, I think, no longer in use come July, every 5 cents collected would be allocated to the Minister of Local Government. And he will then determine basically the allocation. But Madam President, this is a long tradition, and we are not in Trinidad and Tobago making use of established knowledge in the field. Taking the tax to fill a hole at central government is going to create needless resentment on a tax that we absolutely need. And I think it is important it's good to hear the government says they will come. It's an assurance. But the reality is we need now to understand that local government needs to be financed, and every regional corporation which is starved for funds, and the flooding we have seen because they did not have the funds to clear the water courses. I saw the Honorable Minister of Local Government with tall-top boots and so on going through flood waters. I think we could avoid that if, Madam President, we as a society indicate that this is one tax. It's idiosyncratic, you see. It is peculiar. It's not like the other taxes, which are flows. This tax, yeah.
Senator Ameen, members and correspondent, please, Senator Mahabir is giving a very enlightening contribution. Can we please listen to him? Senator Mahabir.
And I thank you, Madam President, for giving me this opportunity to deliver my first lecture in public finance in a career that is coming to a close. But you see, Madam President, yeah, it's coming to a close. In the Senate, of course, but not outside. Madam President, the wealth taxes have a long history. As injurious as they may be to someone's wealth, we have to pay the property taxes. Because if we don't, what will happen is that the services we need at the ground level will not be financed. And it is important for citizens to accept and embrace this tax. Nothing is more injurious to a government when a citizenry indicates to the government that for whatever reason they are not paying this, it is not good public policy. So let us see how soon we can get the matter of local government financing before us. For those who say, Madam President, that this is all theoretical and all hypothetical, I want to refer to this particular book. It is called First in Trinidad, Michael Anthony, and I want to express deep gratitude to Michael Anthony for outlining the history in Trinidad and Tobago, which indicates that the first property tax was not 1920, it was 1851. And let us see exactly what happened at that time. And you see, I'm buttressing my amendment, Madam President. My amendment is, I want this thing to go to local government. On page 98 of this book, First in Trinidad, what the author says is that the first system of primary education in Trinidad emerged in 1851, when Lord Harris, having established the wards, called on each warden to open at least one school, having established the wards. And then Harris, he continues in page 99, Harris was depending on money from ward rates. Harris was depending on money from ward rates to run the primary schools. History, Madam President, 1851, Lord Harris established the wards, he established the counties after the patron saints of England, Wales, Ireland, and St. Andrew, St. David, St. Patrick, and so on. Victoria after Queen Victoria. And then he established the ward rates. And Madam President, these ward rates were used to actually build schools. I went to Cunupia Government Primary School that was opened on 31/8/1931. It was financed, and it was built by the colonial government, financed from levies on the plantations in the ward of Cunupia. And that's how the colonial government financed the thing, so that we are not really far removed from the Canadians and the whole 170 countries from devoting our property tax rates to local expenditure. So I really look forward to the Honorable Minister of Energy, former Minister of Rural Development, for dedicating this amount of tax. And when we do that, we will see that there is a vast literature that is developed. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It was indicated quite as early as 1956, Pure Theory of Local Expenditure, Charles Thibault, Journal of Political Economy, where he indicated that once you are able to allocate your taxes to the local government bodies, people will move so that in these locales, so that there is a proper allocation of people and services. Where there are a number of young people, you will get a lot of parks with little toys in it. Where a number of older people, parks with lanes to walk. And you have an efficient allocation of resources. The Wallace-Oates argument, well developed abroad, that not all jurisdictions, Madam President, will have enough money to finance their social services. You might have one like Tunapuna with a lot of properties and a lot of money, and one like Tabaki, Talparo with a small amount of properties and a smaller revenue. And this is where the Minister of Local Government comes in to arrange a transfer mechanism based upon minimum level of services. Minister Franklin Khan knows what I'm talking about. He would have gone through all of this in the local reform government process. I'm just wondering, why is it we haven't seen this before? And I say this, Madam President, the last time I saw a piece of legislation on local government was September of 2013. That's 5 years ago, when we were debating the amendment to the proportional representation for the selection of aldermen. We haven't seen one since 2013. And I think that the government may have erred a little bit in not bringing that piece of legislation first, targeting it with valuation, and coming to the property tax. It would have made for greater symmetry in how we had this particular piece of legislation before us. But we are awaiting the Minister of Local Government as well, to see his contributions on the matter. Unless we do this, Madam President, what will happen is this. There will be, in Trinidad and Tobago, people who will indicate that my property that I accumulated via frugality, it is impossible to accumulate property without having a good bit of postponement of consumption. Every property owner in Trinidad and Tobago has been frugal, and he will ask himself, why should I use the fruits of my frugality to finance the whole that is in government based upon government's misuse of funds, as Senator Shrikissoon has indicated? This is where the resentment will lie, because you are using a tax that is derived only because people were frugal. You see, an income tax is not because people were frugal. The expenditure... Yes.
Senator Mahabir, I also now have to caution you a little bit, because You've dealt with certain aspects of the bill, but you are sort of going off a little bit, and I need you to be a little more focused on the bill.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me be focused on the bill. And again, I want to focus on the piloting of the Honorable Minister of Finance. And this is where the Honorable Minister of Finance indicated that a pensioner just means you have retired from employment. Well, that is the definition of the pensioner. That does not by any means mean that the pensioner is someone of means. And I want to challenge the assertion that the pensioner in Trinidad and Tobago is necessarily someone of means. Madam President, let us take a pensioner who is retiring in 2018. When was he born? He was born 1958. When did that pensioner graduate? And I'm not talking about a pensioner, Madam President, who is working for minimum wage. A pensioner who went to UE. He graduated around 1982. When he graduated in 1982, he got a job. We were buoyant at the time. But you know what happened 3 years later? 3 years later, this particular employee faced a 10% cut in his salary, 1987 structural adjustment. And not only did he face a 10% cut in salary, this is economic history. This particular pensioner was also denied his COLA. The Minister of Labor will attest that I am not fabricating this, that he lost his COLA, and that COLA was repaid only around the year 2000. Public officers were denied. No, she doesn't know. But public officers were denied. The last time there was a restitution was in 2000. Where am I getting, Madam President? I am getting to the point where the Minister of Finance, the acting minister, the minister in the Ministry of Finance, said that the pensioner just means you have retired from employment. But we need to be looking, you see, a tax must not only be efficient, it must also be equitable. This particular pensioner who has faced a cut in salary would have attempted to obtain a property come the 2000s, late 2000s, property prices rose, interest rates rose. I am asking, come 2018 when he's retired, how many of these pensioners would say, well, I have just retired from employment, I am a person of means? I would be very surprised if many of these people retiring in 2018 are people with a significant savings account. They may be waiting. If that's so, Madam President, we wouldn't be so concerned with the Comptroller of Accounts taking 3 years to pay gratuities. So that we have to be concerned about individuals who are retired. Madam President, the concern I have about the retired population is this. And if I were into electoral politics, and I am not, though I may get there, I am not, yes, I may get there. I'm toying with the idea, right? and I see Senator Khan with consternation in his face. Madam President, that's just tongue-in-cheek. But really, independent Tunapuna, independent Tunapuna, 2021, that could make a nice dynamic. But Madam President, let me get back to the debate. Enough fun. I mean, we need to lighten the mood a bit, but the reality is this. When we look at the equity aspects of a tax, and I would have thought that the amendment would have addressed this as well, is that if we are seeing from now until 2048, some 30,000 persons entering the pool of the 60-plus pool. They are living longer. By 2048, it is estimated that the over 60 may very well be half of our population. It's a pool that is growing in number. What is happening is basically this. Having lived and so on all their lives, and they are now retired, they are using less local services, producing less garbage. They may have a big house empty, their children have grown and their children have gone. In Trinidad and Tobago, we don't sell properties the way it is done in another jurisdiction with a large amount. People tend to remain. So that once without an independent rent assessment board, you see, their properties may be assessed based upon the number of rooms and so on that they have. And they are not generating the kinds of pressures on local services as, say, a family of 4 with young children. My own position is, given that the economic environment for the worker retiring today may not have been the most buoyant one, I think we should give serious consideration for levying a tax, and I would have liked to see this in the amendment, a tax for the 60-plus group of 1%, as opposed to the 3%, and that's the residential group. Why do I say this? I say this, Madam President, because by far and away, it may very well be that the minister is right. You may find some pensioners who have retired very well, but, Madam President, you may find that 99% of them may just be struggling. And Senator Hussain made a very valuable point in his contribution in the former debate. We will have to pay, or everyone will now have to be prepared to pay a higher WASA rate. This particular bill here is going to immediately influence WASA's rate base, so that WASA may not have to go to the Regulated Industries Commission to get any rate increase. This particular act will do it for WASA. So we are going to get an increase in the water rates to the retiree, although you see, this is where the inequity arises. His children have grown.
Senator Mahabir, I really need to understand where you are at. I think you are dealing, in essence, I may be wrong with clause 12 and what the minister had said in her presentation, but while you're dealing with it, we need to be a little more specific. Okay?
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I have tabled one amendment I wanted, and I've spoken to that. I wanted this particular tax to be allocated where it should go, where it has gone in all the 180 jurisdictions in the world. I don't want us to be in any way out of the loop with respect to the efficiency, but I'm looking at equity concerns. And as I thought, the amendment was not complete. Maybe I should put another amendment that with respect to retirees, because I'm well within my right to propose a second amendment, with respect to retirees, I am proposing, based upon the arguments I have advanced, that they are going to have properties which are not going to, and it comes from the First Amendment, that it's not going to impose much by way of work on social services at the local level, that the government gives consideration to a 1% tax on the 60-plus population. I think once we do the two things, once we allocate the tax to local government, and the minister has indicated, Minister Khan has indicated that that will come, and once we can look at the fact that the retirees may have huge homes and less pressure on social services, and we give consideration to a 1%, I think the tax shall be more palatable. If we don't do that, there can be, as the minister indicated, if we forget, let's see what exactly he had indicated to us, that if we forget, as she said, to forget is the same as to throw away. Let us not throw away the memory, and we have a good chance to get it right. But if we don't do that which is right, we will get it wrong. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Parliamentary Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries.
Thank you, Madam President, and good night at 8:16 p.m. Madam President, it's a pleasure to join this debate at this point in time on a bill I'm sure that has taken, a lot of emotions from most of the members who would have contributed so far. In some instance, Senator Mark, well, I don't want to say anything further to his contribution, but I will respond to a couple of statements and comments he would have made. Again, Madam President, thank you for the opportunity to contribute on this bill entitled An Act to Amend the Property Tax Act, Chapter 7604. Madam President, I'm not going to take my 40 minutes because a lot of what has been said in this debate, we will find ourselves repeating in due course. And I'm going to spend a couple minutes, Madam President, speaking about the structure of the tax, the impact on agriculture. Of course, agriculture goes hand in hand with land, and land, this whole bill is dealing with property. And as we all are aware, the bill that we would have debated earlier and completed would have set the tone for this Property Tax Act. I would go briefly in terms of some of the contents of the bill, and then I would end my contribution, Madam President, with some of the work that is required in the land administration, in the whole way in which the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries deals with land and the land administration. Madam President, Senator Mark, in his contribution earlier, he paid particular attention, I paid particular attention to some of the statements he would have made. And these statements, Madam President, regarding what the UNC would have done while they were in government, because a lot of his contribution, Madam President, were a lot of song and dance about the, in terms of caring for the people, and this property tax is going to significantly trample on the rights of citizens and so on. Madam President, Senator Mark spent a lot of his time complaining about the fact that the UNC supported the land and building taxes legislation. And he made some statements, Madam President. He indicated during his contribution regarding the UNC, this is what we are doing when we were there. He indicated we were moving to do some items they were moving to do when they were there, when the UNC was in office. And he indicated that they didn't get to revise the legislation, Madam President. Madam President, the record of the United National Congress in government, I want to share with this Honorable House and all those looking on. This is the record of the UNC, which loves the land and building taxes, Madam President. The land and building taxes, Madam President, was enacted in 1920. And this is the same land and building tax we are talking about the UNC is holding so dear to its chest. That is some 98 years ago, Madam President. The Act has been amended 16 times, Madam President. The UNC has amended that Act one time in 1996, Madam President. So in 98 years, Madam President, one time, the United National Congress has touched that Act. Let us see what they did from June 2010 to June 2015, Madam President. The United National Congress, Madam President, introduced the Land and Building Taxes Bill in 2011, 18th of February 2011. Madam President, that bill elapsed on June 17, 2011. And Madam President, after June 2011, the United National Congress introduced 110 bills, 110 pieces of legislation in this and the other place, Madam President. Not one, Madam President, not a single bill dealt with land and building taxes. But they claim here today that they are in love with land and building taxes. Not one. Madam President, what was Senator Mark speaking of? What does he mean by we are in support of the land and building taxes legislation? This is what we are doing when we were there, Madam President. These were his statements. We were moving to do this when we were there. We did not get to revise the legislation. Madam President, for 4 years, the United National Congress did absolutely nothing about land and building taxes or property taxes. Zero, nada, nilch, naught, Madam President. Absolutely nothing. And so today, Madam President, today, it is this administration, the People's National Movement, that must bring legislation to further modernize the system of property taxes in this country. And I have said it over and over again. Property tax is an issue that sparks a lot of debate. And, Madam President,
I would like to listen to Senator Singh, and I am being distracted from members on both sides. So would you please desist? Senator Singh, continue.
Thank you, Madam President. So, Madam President, when we come here in this August chamber and we paint the picture to those who are looking on, we paint the picture that we so care, Madam President, the United National Congress should be the last political party talking about land and building taxes in this country. But, Madam President, we all know where Senator Mark, his contribution went. Out the door. Madam President, let me go to the structure of the taxes and what we intend to propose, Madam President. And what we are proposing in this bill, Madam President, the taxes, in my opinion, is uniform. It's based on property type, residential, we all know 3%, commercial, 5%, industrial, plant and machinery household, in a building 6%, plant and machinery not in a building 3%, and I want to stick here a pin, Madam President, agriculture, 1%. Madam President, as we have noted on the existing legislation, the whole situation of equity when it comes to agriculture across the board, we are proposing, Madam President, 1%. And I will go to the extent of giving an example of the calculation. But more than that, Madam President, I want to applaud this government that I'm a part of in significantly contributing to the agricultural sector, and by so doing, respecting farmers to the extent of telling these farmers, Madam President, that we respect your business of operation. And let me declare I am a farmer in my different incarnation, Madam President. But that is where the mind, that is where the vision, that is where the efforts are with respect to putting the respect for farmers in this country by that 1%. And I did say I would give an example. But when you compare the whole scenarios with residential, commercial, agricultural, Madam President, as reported in the other place, it is, and it can be compared with a graduated scale going up in terms of economic value. And then when we come down to agriculture, it goes down because, Madam President, any right-thinking government would certainly want to encourage the agricultural sector and encourage agriculture on the whole. And I would use the example, Madam President, of most rental value for agricultural property. So farmers looking on would have no fear in understanding what this bill means to them. And Madam President, throughout most leases, land tenure documents, you would understand that agricultural property, Madam President, on the rental value is approximately $400 per acre. And when you do the maths, the simple mathematics with respect to putting that 1% tax on $400, Madam President, it comes down to a mere $4 per acre per annum. And that is not taking into consideration the percentage that we would have to apply on a subsequent occasion, like the property tax for residential, where it is 10%, the 3% of the annual rental value, and then you minus the 10% for any variations and so on. So, Madam President, it can even go under that $4 per acre per year in terms of what an agriculturalist or agricultural sector would have to pay for the taxes for agricultural land. Madam President, let me go further. And I want to move to some elements of the Property Tax Amendment Bill. And it's clear, 25 clauses. It deals with the property tax working hand in hand with the tax, the amendments we would have made earlier with the Land and Valuation Amendment Bill, Madam President. It deals with taxes to be collected every year, and I would spend a few minutes with respect to that. It deals with taxes on condos, townhouses, apartments. I would spend a few minutes with that. It deals with objections, penalties, and exemptions, Madam President. So when you look to the intention of this bill, while most of the clauses in this bill, Madam President, is to clean clean up some legislation and make this bill more palatable and understandable to most, Madam President. Madam President, Clause 4 of the bill would indicate that the taxes would have to be collected every year. And connected with this Clause 17, Madam President, would ensure that the timing of which the taxes have to be collected is in line with the financial year of any government, whether it be this one or the other. So the dates would change from the 31st of December, Madam President, to the 30th of September of any of the financial year, which is in line with the way we would like to see this tax go. Madam President, the whole issue of Clause 3, in terms of dealing with townhouses, condos, apartments, and so on, in this changing era, Madam President, we have to be innovative. We have to change the way we build. In some cases, land is limited. In most cases, in fact, land is limited. And in some communities, you can go up for maximization of space and put in good use to land to get the most of it. And this clause here, Madam President, deals with that with respect to the change in times. Madam President, we look to the exemptions in Clause 6. And these exemptions, Madam President, while most, as I said earlier, is to clean up some of the duplication in the bill. Madam President, I want to pay attention to the exemptions of incorporated charitable institutions, and it would read as follows: a charity exempted from corporation tax under the Corporation Tax Act for approved charitable purposes. And this is, Madam President, will make it consistent with modern law. And in adding a new paragraph, F, Madam President, we want to place where tertiary education facilities, as the example is used, for taxes will be applying to these facilities, but there must be an occupation of these facilities doing, these activities, because sometimes you would find property being named as institutions, and Madam President, they may not be doing the activities related to these things. So this is just to clean up some of the legislative words and so on, Madam President. Clause 3, Madam President, as I indicated, that dealt with townhouses and so on. Clause 10, Madam President, amends Section 21. And this deals with the objections in terms of having the valuation of Land Act work hand in hand together with the Property Tax Act. And, Madam President, that is almost self-explanatory. When we move now to, I want to move to Clause 12, Madam President, because a lot of persons who would have spoken, or a lot of senators who would have spoken earlier, spend some level of time trying to defend the fact that we are not caring and we are not concerned about persons who cannot afford and all of that. But clearly, Madam President, Clause 12 takes care of most of the concerns of members in this August chamber, because it offers that level of comfort and relief where persons who feel that they cannot afford the property tax and so on can make that application. And I would go as far as saying, an example, Madam President, pensioners, elderly couples, if they cannot pay this, it would be reviewed. And, of course, in the interest of the state, Madam President, it would have to be reviewed every 2 years to see the position of these persons or the persons applying for these exemptions. Because let's just say somebody who couldn't afford it passes away, passes that property to somebody who could afford, Madam President, the state would be required to intervene and collect the necessary taxes. Madam President, I let's move to clause. The clause 24, Madam President, again, exemptions to certain state agencies, and again, it's self-explanatory, and with the schedules listed. I want to spend some time, Madam President, now. When persons earlier, Senator Mahabir or Senator Ameen, would have spoken to squatting and squatter regularization, I want to spend 2 minutes and just deal with that and put that to rest, because of course, you know, it's a question asked by many in society. If squatting is illegal, you know, how do we deal with that? But I would just turn to the State Land Regularization of Tenure Act 25 of 1998, and Madam President, that would give some level of articulation and relief to persons who would have been in occupation of land all over this country. And one simply has to turn to the first report on the Joint Select Committee on Land and Physical Infrastructure, Madam President, because in that Joint Select Committee, most of the concerns that members raised here were well ventilated and responses given. I will just share some of the responses to answer some of the questions that members had here today. And Madam President, a comprehensive social survey was done in this country. And in that, as of the 2012, Madam President, approximately 23,000 squatters applied for land regularization under this act. Of course, Madam President, the law is very clear because it deals with residence or dwellings constructed and completed before January 1st, 1998. So that already gives some level of interpretation to the law where persons deemed as being squatters are taken care of. And Madam President, if you put a value to that, in terms of numbers, as of the 7th of June 2016, an estimated 55,000 families, or over 200,000 persons, Madam President, were identified in that report. And I want to indicate that the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, Madam President, has done a site profiling exercise which was conducted by the LSA. And this revealed 45,850 structures built by persons, of which 34,865 were residential, with the remainder being foundation or sheds and so on. In some 251 sites, with sites being added all even after that. Madam President, so persons who have fear of that document that they received called a certificate of comfort, or persons waiting on a certificate of comfort, all of that, Madam President, leads to my next point in terms of what is the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries doing, and what we are, what we are doing about the challenges faced by a number of issues by mostly the state agencies who has to deal with land and the whole issue of valuation and property, Madam President. And when you look at Trinidad and Tobago, for those who don't know, Madam President, this country, a general breakdown of land, Madam President, is as follows. Most of us would be aware that the total land acreage size in this country is around 512,600 hectares, and 52% of that is owned by the state. Madam President, we all know Caroni 1975 Limited, 31,567 hectares, forest reserve, and why I'll tell you why I'm quoting these figures, because it deals directly with the impact of the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries, having to manage these assets, having to manage and streamline all land matters in this country so that property tax and all similar taxes can be applied. Madam President, as I go on, forest reserve and other protected areas, 167,585 hectares, land allocated for agricultural purposes, and by this, Madam President, I mean areas like Cassenfield, Wallerfield, and so on, 29,863 hectares. Land allocated to state-owned companies and authorities, 37,717 hectares. Madam President, these are the breakdown of land. Of course, simple maths, you minus all of that, all of this what I just called out from the total numbers, and then you would find some portions of private property and so on, Madam President. So figures are already available for land acreages and land distributions in this country, and I would get to some of what we are doing in the ministry, Madam President. Of course, there are challenges in dealing with land management and property management in this country. And one major challenge that comes to my mind, Madam President, is the fragmentation of responsibilities in this country. Madam President, there are 10 agencies, some 7 ministries that have to deal with land. And these, let me give you some examples so you will understand how broad and how spread the whole issue of land management in this country is. Town and Country Planning Division, they have to, Madam President, they deal with land use and development control. Lands and surveys, now separated into surveying and mapping divisions of the Ministry of Agriculture, Madam President. Valuation Division, Ministry of the Attorney General and Legal Affairs, Chief State Solicitor. Madam President, the execution of leases on behalf of the state and the Registrar General, registration of leases, maintenance of land registry. Ministry of Housing and Development Corporation, HEC, management and administration of lands allocated for housing settlements. Ministry of Trade manages industrial estates. Ministry of Agriculture, of course, forested lands and all lands belonging to the state. The Sugar Industry Labour Welfare Committee, settlements for sugar workers and cane farmers. The Commissioner of State Land, Madam President. Ministry of Public Administration and Communication, Property and Real Estate Services Division. Ministry of Works and Transport, Highways, Major Road Development. Ministry of Energy, Allocation and Management of Mining Leases. The Tobago House of Assembly, all lands belonging to the state in Tobago. EMA, Environmental Management Agency, Environmental Ecological Management and Control. The Land Settlement Agency, regularization, as I indicated earlier, of all pre-1998 state land residential squatters, persons holding certificate of comforts, statutory leases and deed of leases, and relocation of squatters from environmentally sensitive areas. And Madam President, when you go down, you have Caroni, you have Palo Seco Agricultural Enterprises, Chaguaramas Development Authority, Port Authority, all these agencies, Madam President, fragmented as they are, having to deal with land management in this country. And what are we doing, Madam President, at the Ministry of Agriculture under the astute leadership of Senator, my colleague Senator, the Honorable Clarence Rambrat, Madam President, as I indicated on many occasions, who has had to spend some long nights, even late into the night, dealing with land matters and trying to streamline, Madam President.
Madam President, I don't want to do this, but standing order 461. Could the Senator refer to some clause in the bill, please?
What clause is Rambrat under?
Senator Ameen, you want to rule on the standing order, or you will allow me to? Senator Singh, you started off by relating what you were saying to the bill. Can you please be a little more focused on the bill, please?
Sure, Madam President. Thank you. Madam President, as I indicated, this whole property tax bill deals with land, and you can't be clear enough if you don't have proper land administration in Trinidad and Tobago to effectively put this land tax into use, because as the bill calls for persons occupying state land, not having or not being the owners of certain parcels, Madam President, we have to get the management of the whole land in Trinidad land portfolio right. And by clearing some of the problems in persons' mind about how the Ministry of Agriculture is dealing with state land to effect property tax, Madam President, that will in essence clear a lot of questions being asked. In fact, where
Senator, please take a seat. Members, please. I really don't want to have to question you after this. Continue, Senator Singh.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, as I indicated, land in this country is limited and the resource has to be managed. And this bill, Madam President, coming from the last one that we would have approved earlier, tying into the property tax, the country, Madam President, dealing with state land, because of course property tax deals with state land, private property. I am specifically dealing with state land in this country and how as a government, through this property tax, we are going to streamline to be effectively in dealing with land leases and collecting revenue in terms of leases and taxes. Madam President, in terms of the management of the property tax where state land is concerned, and again, I turn to the whole structure of the 1% and the impact on the agricultural sector where 1% will be charged. Madam President, and clause 4, as my colleague indicated. Madam President.
There's a fish market down there.
Madam President, the land management system of the Ministry of Agriculture in 2017, Madam President, $6.9 million was used to put in place an effective land management system called the Electronic Document Management System. What this does for this bill, Madam President, is to streamline all data relating to land that could be used by the Property Tax Act, Madam President, in dealing with the proper taxation, the proper identification to charge that 1%, Madam President. Madam President, this also involved the computerization of the information stored at the ministry, where all land leases are concerned, where all documents are concerned, Madam President. Madam President, we also looked at the land information system of Trinidad and Tobago that was disbanded by the last administration in 2011. And maybe they understand why, because as we came in office, Madam President, the entire land portfolio, as we all know, was in a mess. It was scattered, as I indicated earlier, and we are now putting back systems like the cadastral management information systems. And Madam President, what this would do for persons who have fears about where they are located, if they would be charged different rates and so on, the cadastral management information system, Madam President, will be used by the government, will be used by state agencies to identify the maps associated with land so that they could assist in the land information and land management. That is what the People's National Movement government is doing, Madam President. This was launched in 2016, Madam President, by the Surveys and Mapping Division. Madam President, we also intend to develop a national agricultural information system to enable the Ministry of Agriculture, Land and Fisheries and all the divisions to share data. And this is very important, Madam President, where all the data that I have just identified in the fragmentation of land management, all this data is going to be placed on one platform so that when we effect the property tax, Madam President, it will give us a clear picture, a clear identification of how to deal and how to charge persons in the agricultural sector.
Senator,
and I want...
Please have a seat. Senator Ramdeen, please. The Senator's contribution is directly related to some of the issues that were raised by Senator Ameen. Yes, you asked about the ability. So please listen to what the Senator is saying.
Thank you so much, Madam President, for that clarification. I mean, since I've started, it's all land I'm speaking about, and this bill is a land bill. And they ask the questions, Madam President, and I'm putting most of the questions to rest that even Senator Mark raised in his contribution in speaking to this bill. Madam President, so, as I've said earlier, in my contribution, I want to place on record that the agricultural sector really should take this property tax bill and run with it, because at the end of the day, we care about the agricultural sector. And had it been for the land, and building taxes under the UNC style, Madam President, where 10% was attributed to agricultural land, certainly that could tell you where they were thinking and where they were heading. So, Madam President, as I indicated, my contribution was going to be pointed and very, very brief in terms of my arguments that dealt with what we are doing at the ministry. And I want to say that this property tax, Madam President, this amendment bill, is very focused. It is time that we as a nation understand. Times have changed, and it is not business as usual. This country is in a situation now where we have foregone over $1 billion from land, property, and property taxes. And more senators in almost every contribution ask this government for disciplined approach in terms of balancing our budgets. And this is one measure that we are demonstrating some discipline, notwithstanding the popularity of the decision, Madam President, because that is what a responsible government will do for the people of this country. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. As usual, I always wait with great anticipation at times to contribute to any bill that would redound to the benefit of Trinidad and Tobago. And there's a saying in this country that goes, basket, don't hold water. Just like this P&M property tax, we want the people of Trinidad and Tobago to know that it will hold no water, and we will not stand by and allow this tax to be sent down the throats of the people of this country. But I want to begin by, because the bill, the amendment, makes for some interesting reading, Madam President, and there's a very interesting clause that starts with clause 4, and it reads as follows. Section 10 of the Act is amended by inserting after the word 2010 the words, and for the 1st of January of every subsequent year thereafter. So I am not sure which act the Honorable Senator was speaking to before, all right, that Senator Singh. However, he mentioned a 1%. I'm not sure if it's the 1% that supports the P&M that he was talking about. So I just want to remind Senator Singh that basket really and truly does not hold water.
You and friends set them up.
So I would like to turn to another clause in the Act, Madam President. This would be clause 9, according to the Bill Essentials.
You're in the right bill.
Right. And the proposed new section states, where there is a charge or variation in the information in the possession of the board in respect of land for which tax liability has been imposed, the board shall forthwith amend the assessment rule and issue a new notice of assessment under Section 17. Not to run afoul of standing orders, Madam President, I just want to remind persons of the issues we had regarding the different measures available to the Evaluation Tribunal to arrive at a valuation to support the basis of the tax of a particular property. And we debated with much tribulation the issues regarding which measure would be the final and the superior measure. However, we note that the tribunal can use, well, the commissioner, can use any measure that he or she deems fit. So therefore, given that this clause 9 of the bill, not 4, basically mentions a change and a variation of the information, and we are worried about the method by which this commissioner may decide or arrive at the final base for tax for a particular property. it shows the level of injustice that could be meted out to the people of Trinidad and Tobago by this particular clause and by the Act in general. Now, having addressed that particular issue, which colors my entire presentation, the ad hoc nature of this tax and the ad hoc nature of taxation under this current incarnation of the PNM, under the member for, I believe it's Diego Martin West, Member of Parliament, Dr. Keith Christopher Rowley. It's a very sad day for me to be here, to be bringing to the people of Trinidad and Tobago these concerns. However, I must. So, as I mentioned, Clause 9, and the ability for some ad hoc measure or measures to be taken regarding your valuation, we must take into consideration the environment of taxation that befalls Trinidad and Tobago. And I want to begin my substantive contribution with that, the environment of taxation, Madam President. The property tax must be seen against that background, because we are approaching 3 years of this government's time in office. I can't be saying 2 years and 8 months and that kind of 2 years and 9 months and that kind of. So we are approaching 3 years of this government's time in office.
Total incompetence.
All right. And whilst the interjection actually befits the measures that are being imposed, the first one, an increase in the green fund tax. Same for business levy. Unemployment, 5% increase in corporation tax, 10% increase for banks, 1% tax on profit, increase in profit tax regarding, sorry, that's a typo. A tax regarding VAT. We all know that 12.5% applies to all goods as opposed to what obtained before where there were some VAT exempt goods. So the property tax and also an increase in fuel, in diesel, doubling from $1.70 to $3.41, right? So therefore, the increase in diesel definitely will be felt on the distribution sector and the companies that operate in that sector. And now comes the property tax. So the property tax is not an isolated measure. And at the present time, it is too a severe tax to impose on the population. There needs to be greater clarity in how the tax is arrived at and how it shall be determined. And the property under industrial, such as plant and equipment, also the issues around that need to be clarified. I was reading an article from today's Guardian by Avinash Singh, page 6 of the Business Guardian, where Christopher Alcazar, the president of the TT Manufacturers Association, laments, and I would like to quote, Madam President, with your permission. With all due respect to the different things the government is doing, raising taxes, removing subsidy, having problems with border control, having problems with the Port, Chemistry, Food and Drug Administration, all these things do not create an environment that really helps us grow. And he concluded also, because they are using we collect VAT when we sell a product. So you are talking about a process where we have paid VAT in the port, and we have paid because we are selling the product. We have paid all this money to the VAT office, and what a manufacturer genuinely has is a VAT return as a result. Because they are using the consolidated fund, that is the BIR, office says, we don't have the money to give you back your money. Now, so their working capital is now tied up in these VAT returns regarding the VAT office. And the VAT office is lamenting that it's gone to Corporation Soul. It's gone somewhere they have no control of. The reality is, whether the property tax, the same fate shall befall it. So therefore, you will be in an area where the government is not providing you with simple things, such as fire hydrants. So if your house is on fire and you are living in Laloon, Marak, you are living in Ikakas, you are living in Matura or Matlot, you don't have to wait 2 hours for an appliance to come from the fire station that might be in Sangre Grande or that might be in Point Fortin or Princestown, as the case may be. Because the property tax, again, I want to echo the sentiments of the coordinator of the independent bench, Senator Dr. Mahabir, where local government reform should be the first step before you introduce any changes in the taxation regime regarding land and buildings in this country. So clearly, this government has put the proverbial cart before the horse. And it's trying, and even in the bill that we debated prior, is not concerned with having a full picture, but once 50% of the valuations are done, everything is honky-dory and it's okay. Now, when you look at the measure to increase the property tax, Madam President, it really shows you some grave issues. $253 million is the target for 2018. I've heard many figures, but when I look at, as a trained economist, I go to the documents presented and prepared by the Ministry of Finance, and based on that 2018 estimate, it's $253 million is expected to be generated from taxes on property in Trinidad and Tobago. In 2017, they estimated double that, $503 million. However, if you look at the contribution from the minister in the Ministry of Finance, that would be Minister Alison West. The minister indicated that 500 million roughly, $500 million plus in tax should be obtained from the 700,000 plus properties. Now, really and truly, I'm not sure if the minister is privy to the process by which the appropriation bill was prepared, but what the minister is saying is totally at odds with what is prepared by the Ministry of Finance. I think the minister needs to check her facts and get it right before making misstatements in the parliament. Now, $253 million. I think we are finishing at 9 o'clock. So what I will do is wait for the bell to ring, because it's only 10 seconds remaining. And the next time I rise, I will show how that statement by the minister is at sea and definitely doesn't hold water. Thank you very much.
Madam President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 1st of May, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. During that sitting, we plan to complete the debate on the Property Tax Amendment Bill. I just want to put the Senate on notice that we will meet again on Thursday, the 3rd of May at 2 p.m., where hopefully we would have completed Property Tax Amendment Bill by then, and we will proceed to the Insurance Bill. Thank you.
Honourable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, the 1st of May, 2018 at 1:30 p.m. All in favour say aye. Aye. Any against say no. The ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, the 1st of May, 2018 at 1:30 p.m.